The young lady understood perfectly well that if she had another chance, then she would be able to change everything. She understood that in that case, she would have lived much longer than in her current life. She felt very sad because she was betrayed again by people close to her. The king of the underworld looked at the man with fury and informed him that he knew about his monstrous misdeeds, because the man was simply mocking the common people. At that very moment, he furiously told the man his sentence. The man begged the king for mercy, but it was all in vain. At that very moment, the king casually told his subordinates to bring the next one. A moment later, he was taken aback as the Dash had very willfully entered his underground kingdom. The king looked at the lady in surprise and asked why she was in such a place. Talon smiled and said that she just died. She also said that in this life she had a different name. Since he did not understand how she managed to die again, she said with a smile that she was simply poisoned. But after a moment, she fell silent, looking at the king with a satisfied smile. The lady was furious because she had been hit by a car in her past life. The next time, unfortunately, her health failed her. She also died because of a conspiracy by her loved ones. She was angry because on top of everything else, she had been poisoned. She was furious because she did not understand why, every time she turned 25, she died tragically. At that very moment, she demanded from the king an answer to the question posed. She did not receive her answer as the king was distracted. The young lady was furious and did not understand why such unpleasant things were happening to her all the time. The king smiled and asked his old acquaintance to calm down. She was burning with anger and did not understand how she could calm down. She demanded that he compensate her for the moral damage. He sighed and said that he agreed with her, and also asked if he should arrange for her reincarnation. She knew it wasn't the best option, but she still understood that it would be very tedious to start from scratch. She smiled and asked him to transfer her soul into the body of some beautiful girl. He was surprised, but she said that she would like the girl to be rich, fit, young, and beautiful. She also asked for a handsome groom and no relatives to boot. He smiled and said he had just the right body in mind. But the young lady saw that he was up to something. Talon, looking at the king, told him everything she wanted to see in a young girl. The king said that the girl was in the same era and dimensions that she was before her death, because it would be easier to adapt. He said that when she reached his favorite age, he would make sure that she did not die. The young lady knew that this was all very well, and that there was still a catch somewhere, but he said that if she did not want it, then he would not consider this option. Talon sighed heavily, and looking at the king said that she needed at least some guarantees. Talon knew he might have lied to her. At that very moment, the king presented her with several gifts. She was surprised and did not understand that he had provided her with such a thing. The king said that inside the necklace there were several stones, and they contained various items with spells. The red stone is capable of curing any disease and even resurrecting a person. The blue stone is capable of blinding a person. After drinking a potion from this stone, the person will see what its owner sees. Green stone can endow a person with any abilities. At that very moment, the young lady saw a small but beautiful caramel. The king smiled and said that he finally wanted to inform him about the golden pearl, but she did not listen to him, and she ate it with the speed of lightning. Talon was a little puzzled, but since she tasted so good, the king froze in shock when he saw what she had done. At that very moment, her young lady rose into the air with ease like a bird. She was a little puzzled, as she did not understand what was happening, and at that very moment, she heard an angry voice from the king, as he did not understand why she ate it. He was shocked and shouted at her to stop, but the young lady disappeared at that very moment. The Dungeon King was a little puzzled. He didn't understand what he should do now. She didn't hear what exactly the pearl was giving her, but she knew that she would be reborn and live a new life. The young lady rushed forward with joy and new hopes, and at that very moment she saw a beautiful portal that opened only for her. After a while, she opened her eyes and saw a nice house. The maids were talking to each other, but after a moment, they heard a noise and turned around. The young lady looked at them with bewilderment and greeted them, but the maids looked at her with horror and screamed as if they had seen a ghost. She looked after them with a smile because she understood that they were scared, and this was normal since before they had only seen a corpse. And at that very moment, the young lady slowly rose and walked towards the mirror, but on the way, she saw beautiful silver hair reaching down to her waist. She saw beautiful eyes shimmering with an emerald color, and at that very moment, she froze in shock. Some time later, the young lady quietly reflected on everything in the Duke's residence. She was puzzled because the king said that he had his eye on a young lady. She was the only daughter in the family, rich and wonderful. She was in the same era and in the same dimension, and therefore it will be easier for her to adapt to the environment. But looking at her reflection, the young lady realized that she had been deceived. She was furious because she knew that it was difficult to take even a few steps in this body. She wanted to go towards her goal and live long and not get sick, and also marry for love. She understood that since she had returned to life again, nothing mattered to her. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile as she saw that she had already stood up. But at that very moment, she looked at us with alarm, her mistress, and shouted at her not to stand in her nightgown in the draft. She said with a smile that she would help the young lady sit up so that she would not get sick again. For a while, the maid just blew dust off her mistress. Talon was a little puzzled, but did not answer. She understood that even if there was a typhoon, it would not move her from her place. She looked closely at the maid and asked who she was. The maid sighed heavily, and looking at her mistress with sad eyes, said that she seemed not to remember. Sherry Miura looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and introduced herself, saying that she was her personal servant. The lady looked intently at the maid and asked her to tell her everything she needed to know. The maid told her mistress that her name was Rukmana Iveta Rodelin, and she was the Duke's only daughter. The lady was taken aback, as she had heard about the Duke in the past. It was he who took custody of war orphans. Unfortunately, she didn't know him personally, but she understood that she would soon find out what kind of person the Duke was. Still, she was glad that she was his only daughter. Sherry said with a smile that she was brought up with the love and care of her father, and grew up quickly, one by one. Iveta looked intently at the maid and said that she had one question. She wanted to know what was the reason why she was unconscious for a whole month. The maid said that they suspected that the mistress had been poisoned, and even the doctor himself said that they should give in since there was little chance that she would wake up. She was surprised that she had been poisoned, but at the same moment the puppy shouted that this was not so, and that these were just suspicions. She said that the lady was very kind and no one would dare to harm her. Iveta was puzzled and did not understand what had happened again, that she had been poisoned, because she thought that aristocrats were protected from such things. Iveta thought for a moment, as she didn't know what reason people had for doing such things. At that very moment, she was informed that her father had returned. She sighed heavily and said that she would immediately get dressed and go downstairs. A moment later, the Duke burst into her room. He quickly rushed to his daughter and began to hug her with tears in his eyes. He shouted that as soon as he heard that she had woken up, he immediately returned home. At that very moment, she asked him, but the Duke's assistant disturbed them and informed them that there would be a dinner party at the Marquis's that evening. The Duke shouted angrily at his assistant as his only daughter had woken up from her illness, and he had no time for it. The Duke told his assistant to tell the Marquise that he would not be there as he intended to spend the whole day with his daughter. Iveta smiled and told the Duke that he could go, and she could join him. She knew that there would be many aristocrats at such an event, and perhaps there she could find a clue as to who wanted to kill her. After some debate and preparation, she attended the banquet. Iveta understood that she was the daughter of an aristocrat, and especially a duke, but it seemed that everyone forgot that she needed to be greeted. She looked closely at all the aristocrats, as she now understood how they felt about the previous owner of the body. A moment later, she called her maid and asked if she was really an outcast in society. The young maid smiled and said that this was not so, because the mistress had one close friend. Iveta was surprised, as she wanted to know who it was. The maid said that it was the Marquise's daughter. Sherry told the lady that they had been close since childhood, but before she could finish speaking, someone suddenly approached them. The lady looked at her friend and with tears in her eyes said that she missed her very much. Ellis said she really wanted to come but wasn't allowed to, but now she's very glad her friend has regained consciousness. Iveta was shocked because she saw the real Snow White in front of her, but at that very moment she said that she had lost her memory and asked her friend to tell her about herself. Ellis felt sorry for her friend, but now she was convinced that the rumors that her friend had lost her memory were true. She introduced herself and said that they were best friends, and no matter what, she would always be devoted to her. Iveta looked closely at the girl as she looked good, but for some reason, her maid did not look at her. Ellis looked closely at her friend and said that her face had become sunken and small. At that very moment, she gave a sign and a large cart with various sweets was pulled up to them. She told her friend that she heard that she was going to come visit them, so she prepared everything in advance. She squeezed a huge bun and asked her beloved friend to eat it, but the lady refused such a treat. Ellis was shocked by her friend's refusal. She sighed heavily and told her friend that she simply couldn't believe she had no appetite since she used to be able to eat a whole plate. Iveta decided not to refuse and took just one bun, but her friend said that she had to eat more so as not to pass out. Ellis smiled and said that of course for her half would be too much, but for her friend it was not enough. At that moment, the young lady froze in place with a look of bewilderment on her face, as she did not understand what her friend had said. Iveta looked at her friend with a smile and said that she was beautiful. The young lady smiled and told her friend that she was always very modest. A moment later, a young man approached them and asked with a smile what they were talking about. She looked at the young man with a smile and said that it wasn't true, because she was only a role model. As a little girl, she said that compared to her friend, she was a wildflower on a mountainside, and she had also gained a lot of weight recently. At that very moment, the young lady's sight was restored when the young man began to mock her, and she looked at the young men with anger. Ellis looked at the young man and told him not to say such a thing because her friend was very beautiful and her inner beauty knew no bounds. Iveta was furious because she saw what kind of friends she really had. Iveta immediately saw that her supposed best friend was only pretending to be her friend. Iveta looked at her friend in surprise and asked who chose her. The Marquise looked at her friend with a smile and asked if she had forgotten about the young man. At that very moment, everyone was informed that the crown princes had arrived at the event. Everyone fell silent for a moment when they saw the handsome princes. Those present watched the princes with admiration as they were dazzling. At that very moment, the young prince noticed a young lady in the distance. He rushed towards her with a joyful smile. Iveta rose to greet the prince, but he hugged her. She froze in place for a moment in shock, as she had not expected this at all. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile, as he was glad that she had finally woken up. At the same time, he tenderly kissed her hand and called her his precious bride. Iveta was embarrassed by this and could not say anything. Sometime later, she and her maid went out onto the balcony. She was puzzled because her maid had not informed her about the groom. The maid said that she just thought she had told about it. She was very embarrassed by this and therefore ran away from the party. Iveta was puzzled as she understood that she had a fiancé and a problem. Sherry smiled and said that the prince was a wonderful man, and a few years ago he fell in love with her at first sight and proposed on the spot. She said that he was the most handsome man in the entire empire, and she couldn't even believe that the lady was his bride. The young lady understood that this was just every lady's dream, but this situation seemed unrealistic. After all, given his status and appearance, he could have chosen any woman, but she did not understand why he courted her and said that he loved her. Iveta sighed and asked the maid why the prince fell in love with her. Sherry looked at the lady with a smile and said that she had already told her this story. Sherry, at that very moment, she again quoted the prince's words wounded. She said that her mistress was touched by his words, that she even burst into tears, and now she could hardly hold back her tears, and it was very romantic. Iveta said that most likely the reason was that she was the duke's daughter. The maid said that she did not know everything about their relationship, but she assured her mistress that the prince truly loved her. At that very moment, she looked at her mistress in bewilderment and asked if everything was all right with her. At the same time, the young lady was closely watching the celebration, namely her groom and best friend. She noticed that they merged in the dance, and surprisingly, were very beautiful as a couple. Iveta stared at the young people, unable to take her eyes off them. She understood that it would be much better if the young people got engaged to each other. She sighed heavily, as she felt a little sorry for the spectacle that had been given to her. But at that very moment, she was taken aback, as she suddenly felt unwell. She was taken aback for a moment and looked at him in bewilderment. At that very moment, she realized that the young man was next to the crown prince. She sighed heavily as she realized that the person in front of her was none other than the third crown prince. Sherry greeted the prince with a smile. He greeted her back and called her by name. She was surprised that he remembered her, He looked closely at the young lady and said that he simply wanted to greet her and talk to her. The Sudanese woman smiled and said that they were listening to him. He looked closely at his friend and said that he heard she had lost her memory, and so he assumed that she didn't know who he was. At that very moment, the young lady called his name and he froze in place. Iveta bowed and greeted the crown prince of the empire, the third prince. She looked at him with a smile and asked if she was right. He smiled and said that if he thought about it, her maid had just said that she had been taken aback for a moment since he was different from his brother. The young lady was a little charmed by him, as he was quite to her taste. At that very moment, she was taken aback as he suddenly approached her and gave her a radiant smile. He looked into her eyes with a smile and said that she probably didn't remember, but she called him Hey or Bioni. She looked away from him, embarrassed, and wondered if the brothers had a habit of getting too close to people. At that very moment, the young man wrapped her in his cloak. Hiram looked at his friend with a smile and said that she had recently recovered, so she needed to be more careful. She smiled and thanked him, but in turn, the young lady could not take her gaze off him. He smiled, and as he left, he said that she would be fine now, so he could leave her. At that moment, the young lady was taken aback as he took her hand tenderly, and after a few minutes, he tenderly kissed her hand. As he left, he congratulated her on her recovery with tenderness in his voice. For a moment, the young lady simply stood there, staring after him. Several days had passed since she woke up. She saw a lot of things, but she knew that her new life would soon begin. She didn't know what dangers awaited her in the future, but she knew that she had to understand who was a friend and who was an enemy. After the reception, the young lady met with her so-called friends. The young lady looked intently at her friend and said that she would like to be a bridesmaid at their wedding. She said that her friend was always dressed in beautiful clothes, and on top of everything else, she would be holding a small, beautiful bouquet. She said that their wedding would be really romantic. The prince smiled and said that it was a very good idea, but they should find out if it was possible. He told the girl that she would be the most beautiful bridesmaid. She looked at the young prince with a smile and said that he flattered hers. Iveta felt sad as she looked at the young people, because after the reception with the marquis, she was becoming more and more convinced that she was right. She understood that the lost people had completely destroyed the life of the young and kind girl who trusted them. Ellis looked at her friend with a smile and asked if she would make her bridesmaid since she was her only friend. Iveta only smiled in response. She didn't know how the real owner of the body endured such a thing alone. The prince said with a smile that during the reception, the marquis had boasted of his marvelous rose garden. He asked the lady if she would like to go and see it with him. She immediately agreed. At that very moment, he glanced sideways at the young bride. Iveta understood that she would be superfluous in this situation. Iveta looked closely at the abnormal people and said that she was very tired and did not want to go anywhere, so they could go together. The prince, leaving, asked his brother to stay with his bride. The young people looked after them intently. Iveta sighed heavily and looked intently at the prince as she understood that his true love was the young marquise. She knew that their pretense towards her was only intended to assert themselves at her expense. She was confused because she was surrounded by fake friends and fake lovers. But now she realized that the previous owner of the body had a lousy life after all. At that very moment, the prince came closer to her and asked with a smile what she was thinking about. She immediately pulled away from him and shouted in embarrassment that she hadn't thought about anything. Iveta saw that he didn't understand anything, but for some reason, it seemed to her that it really bothered him. Iveta was a little puzzled, but he looked at her with a dazzling smile. Iveta was shocked as he attacked her with his beauty again. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and asked him to tell her how she and his brother got engaged. He sighed heavily and said that sometimes he himself did not understand how it happened. Some time later, the young lady lay quietly in her bed, but to her regret, she tossed and turned because she could not sleep. At that very moment, she sat down on the bed, since something was still preventing her from falling asleep. She noticed that the relationship between the prince and the young marquise looked extremely suspicious. She did not know who actually slipped her the poisons. She understood that she needed to be on guard, so that at least this time she wouldn't die from poisoning. She understood who she needed to be wary of. She understood that if her fiancé only wanted power, the duchy, then he would kill her after the wedding. She also understood that he was having an affair. Also under suspicion was her friend who was behaving falsely. She understood that no one had caught her friend red-handed yet, but it was obvious that she hadn't played out the game yet. Iveta was puzzled, because she was thinking about them again. At that very moment, she thought of the last candidate for the role of the killer, but she had already thrown all thoughts away. And him, since despite his handsome face, he was still suspicious. But it seemed to her that the young man had no reason to do something like that. She understood that despite everything that had happened, these were only her guesses, and she had no evidence. At that very moment, the young lady heard some kind of scream and decided to come closer. She hid behind a column and heard her friend's voice. At that very moment, she stealthily saw the prince, who was begging the marquise to calm down. Ellis was furious and shouted at the prince to calm down, as she had to act in the play and please her friend. He sighed heavily and told the girl that their friend had woken up and his headache had returned. Iveta looked closely at the young people, as her assumptions were correct. Ellis shouted to the prince that she trusted him and gave him the medicine. The young lady froze in shock on the spot. But at that very moment, she suddenly felt pain in her heart. She was puzzled as her heart was breaking. And then she realized that these were the young lady's true feelings. She knew she had to get back quickly. But at that moment, she was very upset. And to her regret, she did not keep an eye on the lantern, and it accidentally slipped out of her hands. In a moment, the prince turned around and shouted into the darkness. He was furious because he did not know who dared to eavesdrop on the prince's conversation. He shouted to the man behind the column to show himself immediately. The young lady was in shock, as her body did not obey, and she could not move. She screamed at her body to move, but it was all in vain. But at that very moment, the savior descended upon her and took all the blame upon himself. The young prince looked at his brother and greeted him. But in this way, he covered the young lady with his body. She was shocked because she did not expect this. The prince looked at his brother and asked for forgiveness for disturbing him. But he said that young people needed to be careful. Lex sighed heavily and said that it was true. At that very moment, the young lady wondered how much the young prince had managed to hear, or how much he actually knew. She sighed heavily and said that she wasn't sure, but she didn't want to see the prince anymore. He was shocked and shouted after her, but it was all in vain. Heron sighed heavily when he saw his brother and his girlfriend leave. At that very moment, he turned to the young lady and said that she could go out now. He apologized to his friend because he knew about their relationship, but because of his status, he could not tell her anything. She realized that he hadn't heard that they were trying to poison her, but she assumed he was just pretending not to know. Be that as it may, she knew that he was well aware of their betrayal. The prince reached out to the young lady and told her that she did not need to cry. But at that very moment, she pushed his hand away. The young prince was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, she shouted that there had never been great and pure love between her and his brother. He was surprised, and didn't understand why she was saying such a thing. She asked if he really wanted to talk about the fact that her fiancé was cheating on her with her best friend. She said she cried about it, but asked him to leave her alone. He looked at her in surprise and said that the Eve he knew would never have said anything like that. As she left, she shouted that she had changed since coming to her senses. She thanked him, but also told him to keep what had happened a secret. She also asked him not to pretend to be her friend in the future. She was shocked because she got angry and acted like a child. At that very moment, the young prince looked at her with a smile. But moments later, Heron burst into wild laughter. Iveta looked at him in bewilderment and wondered if he had gone crazy. The prince said with a smile that knowing her character, he expected her to cry for several months, but she really had changed. Iveta said that if he wanted her to continue calling him brother, he had to answer one question, and the prince agreed. She asked why the prince had actually become engaged to her. She wanted to know if it was all because of the Duke's influence. The young lady looked at the young man intently, as she wanted to know the truth. And at that very moment, the prince said that she was completely right. The prince looked closely after the young lady and asked what she intended to do. He wanted to know whether she would take revenge or not. She understood that she now needed to calm down and think about the current situation. She understood that this issue could not be resolved hastily. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't know what she would do, but she wouldn't leave it like that. However, she understood that now she would not do anything. At that moment, the young lady smiled slyly, since she had something more important than revenge at the moment. She understood perfectly well that all the people who had hurt her would fall prostrate before her. The next morning, her young lady set out on his little journey with her father. She sighed heavily and said that she would like to ask something. Without looking up from his documents, the Duke said that she could ask any question. She sighed heavily and said that she would like to break off the engagement to her son, the Crown Prince. But the Duke was taken aback. She looked closely at her father and asked if he would support her in this matter. The Duke was surprised and asked if something had happened. She sighed heavily and said that it had not, and that she was simply curious. She understood that this would not be an easy decision for the Duke, as rumors could spread about his loyalty to the Emperor. But she understood that without his help, she would not see success. The Duke told his daughter that if she made such a decision, he would gladly support her. Iveta looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if this was true. He said that the Emperor had many children, but he had only one daughter, so he intended to support her. The young lady was truly happy about this. At that very moment, she threw herself into her father's arms and thanked him. She understood that the former owner of the body had no friends or loved ones, but she had a good father. The next day, the young maid happily greeted her mistress. She smiled at her, presented her with a beautiful outfit, but the lady yelled at her. She was surprised, because the lady presented her with her favorite dress. Iveta screamed that she would never wear a huge outfit, and after she asked the maid to give her another outfit, she felt the desire to fight. The maid was a little puzzled by her mistress's behavior and said that she could help her, but the young lady shouted that she could handle it herself. At that very moment, she sighed heavily and asked the maid if everyone was gathered. Sherry said that everyone was already on the first floor. After some time, the young lady met with the staff. They looked at her with puzzled expressions. She sighed heavily and said that they were probably wondering why she had gathered them so early in the morning. The chef and the seamstress looked at the lady with bewilderment. The head maid and the knight commander were also perplexed when the mistress informed them that they had an important mission to carry out. At that very moment, she shouted that she had gathered them all here to appoint them as a team of personal nutritionists. She knew that the next 6 months were the beginning of work to implement the plan in the ideal place. Sometime later, the young ladies trained hard. Carlton sighed heavily and asked the young lady to stop. He looked at her intently and in a commanding tone ordered her to immediately take up the wooden sword and practice her blows. She asked for some rest, but he was persistent and said that after such words, she should not relax, and he loaded her with additional tasks. The young lady was shocked by this. Nevertheless, she began the royal weight loss program, which consisted of several stages. She initially trained with the knight commander. She then went on a strict diet. She was very puzzled by everything, but she knew that she had no other choice, but she still wanted meat or something sweet. She looked with envy at her comrades, who were happily eating delicious food. She saw how they devoured various desserts with gusto, and at the same time, she drooled over the wonderful desserts. She hoped that they would take pity on her and offer her desserts as well. But when the young lady asked for them, she received a harsh refusal from the head maid because she was not supposed to receive sweets until she lost weight. The young lady was furious because she knew it was all because she had a very curvy body. She had tears in her eyes, eating only salad, but she knew she couldn't give up. Sometime later, the maid asked the young mistress for forgiveness because they had behaved in an unseemly manner, but she said that everything was fine since they didn't have to adjust to her. A moment later, the young lady looked away with irritation and saw the prince. She did not understand what he had forgotten in her room. He said with a smile that he had been wondering how she was feeling, but now he could see that she didn't seem happy to see him. He looked at her with a tender smile, as he had prepared a gift for her very carefully. Iveta looked at him with bewilderment, as she did not understand what gift he was talking about. At that very moment, he presented her with a wonderful blueberry muffin from the bakery and invited her to taste the muffin together. The young maid looked at the prince with admiration, as she knew that this cupcake was not easy to find, and that one would have to stand in line for a long time to get it. But a moment later, she was taken aback because she knew that her mistress was currently on a diet. At that very moment, the young lady looked at him with fury. Iveta shouted at the prince to take away the dessert immediately. He was surprised and said that even during a strict diet, sweets are allowed. She couldn't stand it and left the room that very minute. At that very moment, he sighed heavily and looked after her intently. Lex sighed heavily, looking at his brother, and informed him that the lady had gone on a diet again. But he knew that she had already gone on a diet several times, but still failed. He looked at his brother intently and said that he didn't want her to embarrass him again, and he had to make sure that she would just calm down and give in. The young man was puzzled, as he knew that it was very difficult to deal with his brother. The young lady met the prince again the next day, but she greeted him as expected. He looked at her with a smile and said that she should call him brother. At that moment he smiled and said that he was hosting a barbecue dinner party that evening. Iveta couldn't stand it any longer, and angrily slammed her fist on the table. She looked at him angrily and asked if it was time for him to return to the palace. He was taken aback and asked if she really wanted him to come back. She shouted that it was so because he was preventing her from losing weight. He asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. She asked in anger if he really thought she was just sitting on water. He looked at her closely and said that he was just worried about her health, as she could have gotten hurt. She said that it probably wasn't that, and there must be a reason why he had been watching her for weeks. Iveta sighed heavily and asked if her brother had ordered him to follow her. He just smiled and didn't answer, but she realized at that moment that she was right. Iveta approached the prince with lightning speed and said menacingly that if he continued to interfere with her, she would break off all relations with him. The young man froze in place in surprise, as he did not expect such pressure from his girlfriend. But at that very moment, he tenderly touched her hand and quietly said that she was right, and that it was his brother's order. But at that very moment, he looked at her with his beautiful eyes and said that now everything was different. But at that very moment, she pushed him away and said that he should understand everything and just leave. He was surprised that she threatened him, and at first it was hard to believe because she always loved to eat well. But now he could say with confidence that she had succeeded in her endeavor, and that's why he didn't want to disturb her, because he saw how serious she was. After some time, the man told the prince that his brother had sent him a letter. Hiram was a little surprised that he suddenly received a letter from his brother, but after he read the letter, he realized that the time had already come, but he was still puzzled by everything that was happening. The young lady sighed heavily when the maid called her. Sherry, while minding her own business, asked the lady if she really hated Hiram now. The young lady smiled and asked the maid what she was talking about. She did not understand why she thought of you in such a way. The maid said that the lady had been constantly avoiding the prince, and that she had never done anything like this before. Iveta asked if Lady could continue to communicate with another man if she was engaged. The maid smiled and said that they would soon become a family, and asked if relatives couldn't get along. Iveta realized that everything was more complicated than she had assumed, so she asked her maid why she was so worried about it. Sherry smiled and said that she just hoped that they would soon make peace because the prince was very kind, even to a servant like her. She looked at her mistress intently and said that she was very grateful that her mistress considered her her friend. At that very moment, she got over it and asked for forgiveness, as it was stupid on her part. But at that very moment, the young lady with a smile thanked her maid for remaining her faithful friend. She smiled and said that she would serve her lady all her life. Some time later, the young lady lay quietly in her bed, thinking about everything. She was a little puzzled because she didn't know what the prince wanted to tell her earlier. But she immediately threw all her thoughts away since she understood that this should not worry her. She knew she should have heard him out, but she had also previously decided that he was his brother's spy. At that very moment, she could not stand it, and sat up as she could not sleep because of her thoughts. But a moment later, the young lady was taken aback as she heard a knock on the door. She walked slowly towards the door, thinking that her maid had come to see her. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she saw a prince in front of her. He quietly covered her mouth with his hand as someone might hear them due to the noise. He looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and asked if she would like to take a short walk. Hiram looked at his friend and said that several days had already passed since he wanted to talk to her. She asked what he wanted to tell her, and at that very moment, the prince announced that he would soon be returning to the palace. She was glad that he had finally decided to return, but at that very moment, she was taken aback as he touched her tenderly. Hiram looked at his companion and asked if she really wanted him to leave. At that very moment, he came close to her, and she froze in embarrassment. Iveta turned away from the prince. She did not understand why he asked her such things. She was very confused, and did not understand why he behaved this way. The prince sighed heavily, and looking at the stars, said that she had said that she would not do anything for now. He sighed heavily and asked if she would really take revenge one day. Iveta asked indignantly if he really wanted to stop her. He sighed heavily and said that he would not stop her, and he didn't even care what she did. The young lady was a little puzzled, as she had expected completely different words. But at that very moment, the prince looked at her tenderly and said that if she allowed it, he would always be by her side. She was a little puzzled. She didn't understand why on earth he wanted to be with her. She said that he must have forgotten that he was the younger brother of her fiancé. He looked at her with a smile and said that he really hoped that she would be able to achieve her goal, because sometimes you want to do what your heart desires. Turning away, he said with a smile that dawn was approaching, and he intended to take her to her room. She looked after him intently, but said nothing. The next day, the prince gathered, and looking at everyone present, thanked them for everything they had done for him. Iveta looked at the prince, or at all the servants, with bewilderment. She didn't understand when he managed to get close to everyone. At that very moment, the prince caught her gaze and looked at her with a smile. Iveta smiled and wished him a safe journey, but in her mind, she hoped that he would never return. She gave him a beautiful and sweet smile as she said goodbye. The prince was immediately taken aback by the young lady's smile, and a moment later, he came closer to her. But at that very moment, with a satisfied smile, he gave her a parting slap on the forehead. He said with a smile that he just wanted to do it, but at that very moment, he approached hers. He quietly whispered something in her ear as a farewell, and a moment later turned around and said goodbye to her. The young lady stared at him for a moment, feeling very embarrassed. She was furious because he had earlier told her tenderly that she should not overexert herself, as he liked her just the way she was. Some time later, the Duke returned to the residence. He was a little worried because he couldn't find his daughter, but he had previously warned that he would return. He shouted to his subordinate that he had only left them for a few months, and they had already managed to relax. At that very moment, he heard the voice of his dearly beloved daughter. The Duke froze in shock when he saw the beautiful young lady who greeted him with a smile. He could not take his eyes off his beautiful young daughter, who had changed beyond recognition. The young man was puzzled, as he had initially received a letter from the Emperor, then from headquarters, and now he had received a letter from Duke Rodolin. His subordinate said that he had most likely received an invitation to a reception in honor of the young lady's recovery. The young man was a little puzzled, as he thought the Duke's daughter was dead, but his subordinate said that there were rumors that she was at death's door, but was miraculously healed. But they were still a little puzzled, as they did not understand why the reception was held only 6 months later. But the young man assumed that a lot of time was spent on treatment. He also informed his master that the young lady's groom was the crown prince, so some of the princes would be at the celebration. The young man told his master that he doesn't want to go there. He can write a letter of refusal. As he left, the young man told his subordinate that he should answer that he accepts the invitation. He grinned and told his subordinate that the time had come to play with the Duke's daughter, and besides, it was a reception in honor of her full recovery. Therefore, this reception would be very graceful and grand. Iveta looked at her maid with a smile and asked how the preparations for the reception were going. Sherry, looking at her mistress, said that everything was going according to plan. Sherry looked closely at her mistress and asked if she really planned to hide her transformation from everyone until the reception. She said that she would not have been able to resist, and it simply seemed like it to everyone in advance. Iveta looked at her maid with a smile and said that the main character appears when everyone is gathered. At that very moment, she burst into wild laughter, as she knew that her appearance would take everyone by surprise. The young maid looked at her mistress in surprise, but did not answer. At that moment, she looked intently at the lady and said that she did not quite understand what she was talking about, but she thought she had caught the gist of it, and she intended to do everything in her power. Some time later, the young lady read a letter from her devoted Logan Elam. She was glad that he was still alive. At that very moment, she looked at her maid and called her with a smile. Iveta smiled and asked her maid if she would be her accomplice. Some time later, they pulled off a small but clever trick. At the same time, the young lady hid in a haystack, while her faithful maid quietly pushed her along in a cart. But still, the young maid was very frightened and did not know what to do if they were caught. At that very moment, she was taken aback, as the young man called her. The man looked at her in surprise, as he did not understand why she needed rice straw in such a quantity. At that moment, the girl was taken aback and hastily said that the lady needed to make several straw figures. Sherry looked at the young man with a smile and began to praise her mistress. She said that her mistress was very strong. If she had been born a man, she would certainly have become a general. After a few minutes, she still managed to talk the young man into submission, and with lightning speed, quietly run away from him. She looked at her maid with a satisfied smile and asked if she was nervous. Sherry sighed heavily and said that of course she was worried, because she was almost caught red-handed. When they left the estate together, she was worried that they went out into the street alone without an escort, since she knew that the city was dangerous. Iveta looked at her maid with a smile and said that she did not need to worry about it since she could protect them. And besides, in such outfits, they look like men. The maid smiled and supported her mistress, since she was very tall and fit. Iveta smiled and asked her faithful friend if she wanted to go shopping. Sherry looked at her mistress in surprise and asked if she wasn't planning to go home, but the young lady ignored the question, and at that very moment they hurried to the various shops. Iveta looked with joy at the beautiful pendant and asked the seller how much it cost. Sherry told her mistress that she did not need the pendant. The man looked at Iveta with a smile and said that he would give the young man a discount for the sake of his beloved. He made a discount, but this was not enough for the young lady, and at that very moment she began to bargain with him. She said that he was selling it at too high a price, and asked how he could prove that the stone in his pendant was real, since she could have lowered the price of the item right then and there. The man froze in surprise. In the end, they still bought this pendant, and the young man, the servant looking with joy at the mistress, said that she would cherish the wonderful gift, and at the same moment, she thanked her Ivetot, my friend, that the stone is fake, but later she will buy her something better. The young maid smiled and said that it was not important at all, and she would still cherish this gift, because it was a gift from her beloved mistress Iveta, looked at her maid with a smile, because she was still very sweet. But a moment later, they heard a terrible scream nearby. Looking into the distance, they saw a young lady shouting angrily at the common people. Ellis screamed furiously at the woman and asked how she dared to contradict her since she was a marquise. At that very moment, everyone started whispering to each other as if they were very sorry for the woman and her son, because the noble lady's outfit had also been accidentally soiled. They said that the woman couldn't handle her children, and she had also caused problems for herself. But it all happened because a noble lady appeared out of nowhere and ran into the boy. But unfortunately, no one present could do anything and could not help the woman with the child. At that very moment, Mark looked intently at her companion from behind and called him. The Viscount was taken aback and looked intently at the lady. At that very moment, she furiously told him to cut off their hands with the trash right away. The young man was taken aback and told the young lady that this was too much for such a thing. Everyone present was surprised and puzzled by her decision, but the young lady was burning with rage and anger. She shouted that this outfit was given to her by the second prince, and they dared to stain the imperial gift. She screamed that he should cut off one hand from each of them, and that would be enough. The woman hugged her son and burst into tears from this sentence. The young man sighed heavily, and with a heavy soul told his mistress that he would certainly fulfill her order. Iveta froze in shock as she realized they had simply gone crazy. The young man looked intently at the woman and shouted angrily that they would remember their indecent behavior for the rest of their lives. At that very moment, the woman hugged her child tightly and closed her eyes because she knew that she could not escape the sentence. But a moment later, a miracle happened, and the young summer woman rushed to the defense of the ordinary citizens of the empire. At the same time, the Viscount was in shock, as he did not expect that anyone would begin to oppose him. He looked at the young lady with fury and asked what she was doing. Iveta, in turn, looked at the young man with fury and said that she wanted to ask him the same thing. The young man was furious and did not understand how she dared to stand in his way. Iveta pointed her sword at the young lady and asked if she was a marquise. At that very moment, the young lady cried out that she was the only daughter of the marquis and did not recognize her friend, and wanted to know who was hiding under the hood. She was furious since the young man did not know what might happen if he stood in the way of the aristocrat. Iveta looked coldly at the lady and said that these lands belonged to the Duke and to prevent such reprisals from happening, they were prohibited here, but they tried to commit lynching against the villagers who were under the Duke's protection. Iveta immediately shouted for everyone to hear that the Marquise had absolutely no regard for the Duke's authority. A moment later, people began to support her, and they shouted that everything was right because they were under the protection of the Grand Duke. They knew that no matter how high their status, they could not touch them without the Duke's permission. The Marquise, in turn, was not going to give in. She shouted that the boy had ruined her precious outfit. Iveta sighed heavily and told her beloved friend not to talk nonsense. His outfit had not suited her from the start, after all. For such a rude man, a gift from the imperial family was like a pearl necklace on a pig's neck. Everyone was taken aback by this, and the young lady was filled with rage and anger. At that very moment, she sighed heavily as she saw that there were too many ordinary people around. She couldn't stand it and fell at that very moment, but the young man managed to catch her. Iveta looked at the young lady with a fierce grin as she saw that she had gracefully fainted and she was quite flexible. But at that very moment, Iveta was taken aback because she saw that it was a young man who had attacked her. But she reacted quickly and protected herself at that very moment. The young man angrily shouted at the girl that before preaching and making baseless accusations, it would be a good idea to introduce herself first. Since she dared to interfere in the affairs of the nobility and defend the dregs of society, he shouted with fury that he would not forgive her for such a thing. But at that very moment, the young lady easily dodged his attack. At the same time, the young man closely watched their fight. He saw that the man who was hiding behind the hood easily controlled the blade, and although his movements were not professional, it was clear that he had honed them for a long time. His assistant noticed that the young man was clearly inferior in weight to his opponent, but he could easily stop him. But unfortunately, he was already exhausted, and soon he would simply fall off his feet. At the same time, the young man was advancing on the young lady with his pressure. Iveta was furious, but she knew she had to win. But a moment later, she was taken aback as the young man dealt her a very strong blow, and she unfortunately dropped her sword. She was very angry with herself as she understood that she needed to train even harder. At that very moment, the young Viscount walked towards her and shouted that it was all over for her. But a moment later, the Viscount screamed in intense pain as someone threw a small dagger at him, and it cut his arm. The Viscount was furious, as he did not understand who dared to prevent him from delivering the final blow to his enemy. The young man looked intently at the Viscount and said that it would be better for him to take the Marquise back to the palace. The Viscount was a little puzzled as he did not understand who was in front of him. At that very moment, the stranger showed his small pass, and at that very moment, the Viscount shouted to his assistants to support the ladies as they returned back to the castle. Those present were taken aback and froze for a moment. But at that very moment, the young man approached the beautiful sword and picked it up. At that moment, the young lady looked at the owner of the sword in surprise. Iveta looked at him with a puzzled gaze, as she did not understand what kind of shady young man was in front of her. But at that very moment, she turned around because she heard someone calling her. The madam looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and thanked her for saving her. Iveta looked at the boy with a smile and said that she simply did what she had to do and did not need to be thanked. Iveta looked at the boy and asked if he would cause trouble in the future. She also said that she was very sorry for his mother and asked the boy to apologize to her. The boy immediately asked his mother for forgiveness and thanked his savior. For some time, the young lady stared intently after the departing ones. A few seconds later, a maid ran up to her and hugged her tightly. Sherry was shocked and did not understand why her mistress acted so rashly. Iveta sighed heavily and said about her maid that she was fine and that she did not need to worry so much. At that very moment, she turned her gaze in my direction and saw the young man who was still next to her. Iveta sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, said that if it weren't for him, they would have made a big fuss. Iveta told the young man that now she was in his debt. The young lady was a little surprised and puzzled. He said such words and just left. She was shocked because she wanted to know who he really was. To her regret, at that very moment, she stumbled and began to fall. But her companion easily caught her, and she fell right into his arms. Iveta looked at him with embarrassment and thanked him for saving her. He looked her in the eye and said that it was amazing that she had lasted any length of time in the fight. At that very moment, she pushed the young man away, but a moment later, she asked angrily what his words meant. The young man looked at her intently and told her that with such skills, she would not live long. After some time, the young lady was studying diligently, but she was burning with anger. Iveta was very angry because she had recently lost a battle. She understood that she needed to train more, but there was one thing that upset her most. She remembered the young man looking at her intently and telling her that with such skills, she wouldn't last long. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had no choice but to admit that the young man's words were true. At that moment, the commander of the knights looked closely at the young lady and said that she should look at everything from a different angle since her movements were unique. He smiled and said that it was very interesting, and he thought that she must not be very comfortable in such a position. The young lady knew that this was so because in her previous life, she was a national fencer, and to her regret, the habit of using the blade as she did then did not disappear. The man looked closely at the lady and said that she seemed to be more agitated than usual. He wanted to know what was going on. She sighed heavily and asked her mentor if there was a way for a girl to win when dealing with a grown man on the battlefield. She wanted to know if there was any winning strategy. The man thought for a moment, as he could tell from the young lady's appearance that she and her opponent were at different stages of skill development. He also stated that fear and lack of confidence would definitely reduce her chances to a minimum, and that it would be very difficult to devise a strategy as she was physically unable to match the man's abilities. But at that very moment, he looked at her with a smile and said that there was one good option. The young lady looked at her mentor with shining eyes and asked which option they were talking about. He looked at her with a smile and said that she simply had to become a swordmaster. She sighed heavily as she understood that this was very difficult. Swordmaster is a title given only to those who have achieved the highest level of mastery in swordsmanship and who are also able to use mana in battle. She looked closely at her master and said that as far as she knew, such people were very rare and only a few people were able to achieve this title. He sighed heavily and said that this was true and she was right, because there were only a few swordmasters in the empire, and one of them was her father, the Duke. And the other one is Duke Winston, who is famous for becoming the youngest swordmaster. The captain looked at her closely and said that she was born with the ability to use mana after all. She sighed heavily as she realized that she needed to train to become one of them, but she assumed that she had used the mana incorrectly, and it was supposed to be impossible for her after all. Iveta was a little puzzled by her mentor's words, as she understood that she had talent and had a chance. Moments later, the knight approached the commander and reported that a message had arrived from the village, and the blacksmith had conveyed that the sword was already ready. The commander was pleased with what he heard and said that he would certainly come and pick it up. At that moment, the young lady looked at her commander with joy and excitement and asked if she could go and get her sword. After some time, the young lady and her maid went to the blacksmith. The man looked intently at the young people and asked what they needed from him. A moment later, he received a small letter from the young lady and understood why they had come. He presented her with a smile as he crafted a masterpiece into which he had put more effort than into anything he had done before, so he could easily guarantee the quality of the product. The young lady looked at her new sword with joy and asked if she could try it out. The man smiled and said that of course she could. At that very moment, the lady swung her sword with ease, and at that very moment cut through the air. She looked at the beautiful sword with joy as she saw that it was very light and fast, and also had perfect balance. She looked at the sword with a smile and told the blacksmith that he had not lied. The man smiled and said that of course it was, since he was the best craftsman in the empire. Iveta looked at her new weapon with a joyful smile. She hoped that it would serve her faithfully in the future. She was very glad that she was able to finally get such a beautiful sword. Some time later, the young lady and her faithful servant were having dinner at the tavern. Sherry asked her mistress if she could order anything she wanted. Iveta smiled and said that, of course, she could order anything she wanted. At that very moment, the young lady looked into the distance and noticed the young men she had met earlier. At that very moment, she jumped off the chair. At the same time, the young people were having a casual conversation with each other. But a moment later, the young lady sat down next to her savior. The young man quickly stood up and looked at the unexpected guest with fury. But at that very moment, the Duke told his subordinate that everything was fine and he could calm down. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was very rude and also asked if she would like to introduce herself. She smiled and said that she was really very sorry because she was just so happy to see her benefactor that she forgot about everything. The Duke was very much surprised and looking at the lady asked what was the matter, as he had not at all supposed that they would meet again. She said that he had been very kind to her, so she should thank him, and since they had met again, she would like him to allow her to restore justice. She looked intently at the young man and said with a smile that he should not refuse. He sighed heavily and said that he did not need any gratitude, and he was afraid that he would not be able to fulfill the lady's wish to restore justice, because as she saw he was eating. At that very moment, she snatched the fork of food from his hands and looked at him intently. The Duke was amazed at such impudence, but he was unable to say anything. A moment later, the young lady quickly began to eat his own food. She enjoyed every bite of the food she prepared, while the Duke looked at her in a stunned way that he had not expected anything like it. His assistant was taken aback as he was stunned by the young lady's behavior. At that very moment, she smiled and thanked him for the food. But a moment later, young Eveta began to slowly reveal her identity to her new acquaintances. She looked at her companion with a contented smile and said that they had met again, so she wanted him to give his permission as she wanted to serve him. After some time, she looked at the wonderful food with admiration and joy. Without hesitation, she shouted to everyone that they should quickly try the exquisite dish, since this establishment was famous for its pork. She looked at everyone present and said that if they did not do this, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. Eveta immediately pushed a whole plate with a wonderful dish towards her maid and told her to try every bite of it. The maid was taken aback, since this dish was very expensive. Eveta, not paying attention to anyone present, enjoyed the wonderful food. She knew that for such bliss, one could endure 10 circles of hell in the training hall. The Duke looked closely at his young companion and noticed that daughters from aristocratic families were bold and outspoken. She smiled and said that she was not being treated for the pleasure of eating, but at the same moment she asked her companion if she had said that she was a noblewoman. He sighed heavily and said that the maid had called her a lady, so it was obvious. She smiled and said that it seemed like she had been careless, but since he had already exposed her, she should probably introduce herself. At the same moment she smiled and said that her name was Eve, and she also said that it would be fair if he also told her his name. The Duke sighed heavily, and looking away from her, said that it was obvious that she had not given her real name, but the young lady did not answer, and only waited patiently for him to say his name. The Duke sighed heavily and said that his name was Rappel. Eveta smiled and said that it was a very nice name, and also said that she was very pleased to meet him. At that very moment, he said that they had already finished with mutual greetings, and now he would like to know her true purpose. At the same time, their assistant sat quietly and enjoyed their meal. She looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding what he was talking about. But at that very moment, the Duke said he wanted to know the reason she had approached him, as he assumed she was only holding back from treating someone because he had saved her from falling. The lady said that she was actually curious about something. He looked at her intently and asked suspiciously what exactly she was curious about. Eveta smiled and said that she was interested to see the difference between the Viscount's true face and what he showed to the general public. She said that he should understand her correctly, since it was just curiosity on her part. He sighed heavily and asked if she was always so careless. Eveta looked at the Duke in bewilderment and asked what he meant. Rappel, looking at his companion, said that she was careless because of banal curiosity in the desire to know the true essence of a person. She was taking a risk, because at the same time, she did not hide at all that she was a noblewoman, and this was quite dangerous on her part. She sighed heavily and asked if he really meant her weakness that time. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. He also asked if she really wanted him to apologize, or maybe she was trying to find out who he really was in order to secretly stalk him. The young lady in turn burst into wild laughter and said that she did not want to know, and that he seemed to have a very rich imagination. She said with a smile that it was true that she had been very unlucky with her opponent, but she was sure that she had done everything correctly, and as for the reception, he could think of it as part of a prepared phrase in planning her future. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment and said that he did not understand at all what she was talking about, and besides, he did not justify her defenselessness. The Duke, looking at his companion, said that if he and the smoke were villains, she would already be standing at the gates of hell. Iveta looked away from him and said that he was not that kind of person, and she was sure of it, so she tried to get closer to him. She smiled and said that she was good at understanding people, and that what happened at the market was inevitable, but she had to intervene despite her lack of experience. Rappel looked at his companion with a smile and asked if improving his skills wouldn't solve this problem. The Duke sighed, and looking at his companion, said that unfortunately he could not resist. After all, he also became very curious. She looked at him with bewilderment, still not understanding what he was talking about. He said he wanted to know where she learned to use a sword like that, why she, a noble lady, had honed her ball skills to such a level. He really wanted to know where she got the courage to speak out without hesitation, even in the face of such a powerful enemy. The young lady, in turn, listened to his questions, but did not answer any of them. At that very moment, she firmly said that she had already made her decision, and this time she would do everything to survive. He looked at her in surprise, because he did not understand what she said. Because if you turn on logic, you can understand that a person lives only once, but her words sowed a seed of doubt in him. She said that she really hoped that her life would be calm and pleasant. Iveta said with a smile that her sword skills were a kind of guarantee for a free and happy life, so that she could protect herself and her loved ones. At that very moment, the young lady was taken aback as the young man approached her very closely. He looked at her tenderly and said with a smile that he understood everything. Unfortunately, he did not quite understand her motives, but he knew that she was very soft-hearted, and he liked it, so he invited her to join the ranks of his knights. A moment later, he started talking about the incident at the market, as he knew she had been unlucky with her opponent. The Duke said at the same moment that her actions were reckless, but her courage was just. The Duke sighed heavily, and with a gentle smile said that the meal had been very pleasant. At the same moment, he told his assistant that they were already leaving. Iveta froze and looked at her young companion with embarrassment, as she was pleased with his words. Iveta was a little puzzled, as he scolded her and praised her at the same moment. She liked such conversations, but still, he didn't answer a single one of her questions. Some time later, the maid with a gentle smile asked the mistress how she was feeling. At the same time, Iveta, with a smile, said that she felt great. A moment later, she asked her friend how the preparations were going. Sherry smiled and said that the captain personally led the knights and patrolled the castle, and Uncle Charles and Uriel were making the final preparations, and Miss Marai should also arrive soon. Iveta looked at her maid with a smile and asked, what about her beloved the prince and that very dear friend? Sherry looked at the lady with a smile and said that they had just arrived. After some time, the young lady came out of the bathroom and told her maid that it was time for them to go. Iveta was glad, because she knew that today, the prelude to beautiful revenge would begin. Some time later, all the guests gathered in the Duke's banquet hall, and the young princes were also present at the banquet. The prince looked at his brother in surprise and asked who he was looking for. Heron smiled and said he was just looking around. Lex sighed heavily and asked her brother if he knew when Fatty would deign to appear at the banquet. Lex was a little puzzled, and after all, on Sunday, he sent her an invitation, but she dared to decline it. He was furious and did not even want to imagine what horror it would be when she appeared in front of all the people. At that very moment, the young lady joyfully ran up to the prince and called him. Lex looked at the lady with a gentle smile and said that she was always delightful. But at that very moment, he looked at the lady with bewilderment and asked why she had a gloomy expression on her face. She sighed heavily and said that she was very worried because the main character of the day and the organizer of the reception was their friend. He looked at her with a smile and said that it was a pity because now she would need all her courage. Lex looked at his friend with a grin and said that this is true. After all, this is not the first time this has happened. Lex mocked his bride and said that she would fail again and would need an even bigger dress. At that very moment, the young lady burst into tears and said that no matter what, her friend would always be her dear friend, no matter what. The prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was as beautiful as ever. Lex looked at the young lady with a smile and asked her to dance, and he also said that he would like the heavens to bless their marriage later. Hiram glanced sideways at his brother and his friend, as he knew that no matter what they looked like, they were unworthy of the young duchess. At that very moment, all those present became silent as they saw the young man. The princes looked at the young man warily. At that very moment, the duke greeted the crown princes. Everyone was taken aback for a moment as they realized who the young man really was. The prince looked at the duke with a smirk on his face and said that it looked like the sun would rise in the west tomorrow because he had not expected that the same ghostly duke would appear at such a reception. The prince said that he had sent the duke a personal invitation but had never received a response because he had wanted to meet him for a very long time. He asked the young duke if he had received the invitation. At that very moment, the young duke bowed and said that he would not answer the question asked. The prince was furious. He did not understand how he dared to show him such disrespect. The duke bowed to the prince and said that he was reminding him that he could always resign. The prince was furious because the duke had shown him insolence and disrespect. Lex was burning with anger and fury as he was disgusted by the duke, and he was already tired of his masks. Minute and the young lady asked the prince if they really just saw a ghostly duke who carried out the emperor's secret orders. The prince was furious since everything was exactly like that, but still he was the emperor's son, and the duke had to show him at least a drop of respect. After some time, the man apologized for the wait with a joyful smile on his face. He looked intently at everyone present and announced that they would soon see the main heroine of the day, namely the duke's daughter. A moment later, the young lady appeared before everyone present. Iveta appeared before everyone in all her glory. In turn, the young marquise froze in place from shock. She simply could not believe her eyes. She reached out to her beloved and precious prince, but froze in place in shock as she saw that he was smitten. Lex froze looking at his bride. He couldn't believe what he saw. He was puzzled and simply could not believe that this young, beautiful, charming lady was his bride. At that very moment, the young marquise pushed her lover, and he came to his senses. At the same time, the young duchess slowly approached the guests present. Everyone present was charmed and surprised by her appearance. She smiled and thanked them for waiting, and thanked them for being present at such a reception, because it was a very important event for her. She also said that she was very glad that they found the time to come to the reception. At that very moment, she gave everyone present her radiant smile and asked them to enjoy the wonderful reception. The young men and ladies stood still for a moment as they were captivated by her beautiful smile, and everyone said that she looked like an angel who had come down from heaven. At that very moment, young men surrounded her as they wanted her to dance with him. The ladies said that they were blinded by her beauty and simply could not take their eyes off her. The young marquise saw how the young men lined up in a row because they wanted to dance with the young lady. She was worried because she was worried that the prince might also succumb to such beauty. Ellis was furious and saw that everyone was praising the young duchess. At that very moment, she turned and looked intently at her lover, for she saw that he was angry. She glared at her so-called friend with anger, as she knew something was wrong. She was furious because she knew that the best beauty salons, the magnificent men, and the place of the empress, it was all hers. But now she felt that her so-called friend was taking it all away from her. Iveta glanced sideways at the marquise, as she thought that the beginning was very good. Cold revenge and a comfortable life for these things. She went through a hellish diet. She saw that the party was going on without any problems, but she knew that now the next test awaited her. Iveta was puzzled as she saw that they were attacking her from all sides. She did not expect such a reaction at all. At that very moment, the young lady saw her father nearby. Iveta quietly screamed and called for her father's wedding, but it was all in vain. She screamed and asked her father for help, but he only wished her luck with a smile. Iveta sighed heavily as she realized she was in trouble. But at that very moment, she was taken aback as she saw a young prince in front of her. He looked at her with a smile and congratulated her. She looked at him in surprise and thanked him. But at the same time, her Naledi understood that it was nice of him. He smiled and said that he would like to ask her to dance. But a moment later, she was also invited by the young ghostly duke. She was a little surprised, but agreed. A moment later, they merged into a beautiful dance. Iveta looked closely at the duke as she understood that it was the duke who was hiding behind the mask. but she did not understand why he accepted her invitation, and most importantly, she wondered why exactly he invited her to dance. He looked at her with a smile and said that she was not what the rumors described her to be. She smiled and said that she would take it as a compliment. At that very moment, he began to dance with her and smiled. But at the same time, the prince watched the young people with fury. He was burning with anger when he saw that his bride was next to the phantom duke. At that very moment, the duke approached the young companion very closely and said with a grin that he would look forward to their next meeting. A moment later, he danced her to the other side. The young lady was embarrassed by such closeness, and she was also very embarrassed by his hoarse and beautiful voice. At the same time, the prince was filled with anger and rage. He did not understand how the duke dared to flirt with his bride. The marquise was shocked by the words of her lover. She asked what he was talking about and hoped that he had thrown out such a phrase frivolously. But a moment later, he looked at her puzzled. Iveta sighed heavily and said that she spent a lot of time to become beautiful, although it was hellishly difficult, but she still managed. She said that she had been waiting for this for a very long time and just wanted the prince to ask her to dance. At that very moment, she looked at her fiancé with tears in her eyes. The prince was taken aback and told his bride that it was a misunderstanding and that he had never forgotten about her. And even when she woke up, he was overjoyed. Iveta looked closely at the young man and asked if this was true. He immediately said that he could swear to her on his honor that these words were true. She looked closely at him because she understood that he quickly got his bearings. Iveta looked at the young man with a smile and asked him to fulfill her wish. He smiled and said that he was listening to her. Iveta looked at the young prince with a smile and asked if he could dance only with her that evening. At that very moment, the young marquise was taken aback and froze in shock. The prince answered without hesitation that he would dance only with her. Iveta looked at the prince with joy and asked if this was true. He extended his hand to her with a smile and asked if she would dance this dance with him. The young lady agreed without hesitation, and at that very moment they looked at each other with tender smiles and walked onto the dance floor. Iveta turned around and called her friend with a smile on her face. Iveta asked her dearly beloved friend if she liked her changes, because earlier it was the marquise who said that she would be charming no matter how she looked, but she still tried and wanted to seem beautiful to everyone. The marquise froze for a moment. She did not know what to answer. At that very moment, throwing aside all her rage, she told her friend that she was beautiful and so bright that her eyes hurt. Iveta looked closely at her friend, as her words had a double meaning, but at the same moment, she thanked her precious friend with a smile for such words. The next day, the young maid told her mistress that the reception the previous day had been simply magnificent, and she even thought she had dreamed it. She told the lady that everyone had come to look at the young duchess. Iveta looked at her friend with a smile and said that she thought she was even more excited than she was. Sherry smiled and said that of course it was, and she was looking forward to the hunting contest that would take place that afternoon, for the knight who first shot the white stag would be the winner, and he would have to dedicate his victory to the beautiful lady and give her the victor's token. She thought that most likely the young man would choose her lady. She said that she was almost sure that all of them would want to dedicate their victory to her lady and give her the treasured rose. She said with a smile that the fight for the hand of a beautiful lady is a very exciting and romantic event. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She knew that there was nothing exciting in this, and she knew that I did not. People change very much depending on the appearance of the girl. The young maid looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and asked why she was so gloomy. She told her mistress to just look at all the gifts that were presented to her. At that very moment, Iveta looked at one small gift with bewilderment. A minute later, she realized that it was a gift from Barclay. The young servant joyfully shouted that all the young men fell in love with her mistress, and now she would be very busy, but the young duchess threw away this gift because she knew that the young man was a very nasty type. At that very moment, the young maid presented her mistress with a beautiful and simply irresistible bouquet. She spoke with a smile about her mistress that these flowers suited her very well. Iveta froze for a moment and looked in surprise at the small note that was in the bouquet. She realized that the bouquet was from the Duke. At that moment, the young lady's face darkened, and she asked him angrily what he was thinking about. Moments later, They heard a knock on her door, but the Duchess was a little surprised, as she did not know who had come to her so early in the morning. A moment later, her new maid came to the door and was taken aback. She was surprised, as she did not expect to see the young prince at the threshold of the young lady's room. But he only looked at the maid with a gentle smile and greeted her. After some time, the young Duchess and the prince were leisurely strolling through the palace. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was breaking young men's hearts. But at the same moment, he asked her with a smile if she did not feel it. She sighed heavily and said that he had no heart, so he should not complain. The prince laughed awkwardly and said that he did not want to talk about it. Iveta sighed heavily and said that it was early morning and she assumed that it was time for him to go, so she wanted to see him off. Iveta looked coldly at the young prince and asked if she should accompany him to the palace. He smiled and said that he had no bad intentions at all, and that he just wanted to see her. At that very moment, she turned away from the young prince, as she realized that he was attacking her with his beautiful and lovely face. She sighed heavily and said that sometimes when she looked at him, it seemed like there was a black curtain on him. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. Iveta sighed and said that everyone thinks he is an ordinary person, and then it turns out that he was behind all the incidents. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that he now understood what she was talking about. Iveta came closer to him and said that she did not know at all what exactly he was hiding, but she knew that he was hiding behind a black curtain. At that moment, the prince looked at her with a grin and asked if this was really true, but nevertheless, he said that he had indeed spoken seriously earlier. Iveta looked closely at the young man, as she did not trust him at all, but the prince assured her that he had been honest with her. At that very moment, the prince said that he would like to make a bet with her, and whoever reaches the corner first can make any wish to the loser. She sighed heavily because she understood that this was just nonsense. But still, the prince smiled and prepared to fulfill the wager, and a moment later, he ran as if scalded. The young Duchess screamed, "I will bring him to stop and not do such a thing." She was filled with anger and fury and screamed for him to stop, but it was all in vain. At the same time, the young duke watched the young people closely standing quietly around the corner. Some time later, the young ladies were sitting at a hunting competition. At the same time, the prince looked at everyone present with a contented smile. The young lady greeted the prince with a smile and wished him good luck. The prince looked at the young ladies with a predatory grin and greeted them. But at that very moment, he turned his gaze towards his bride, but she did not greet him in return. At the same time, the young people looked at the young Duchess with joyful smiles. They said that today she looked like a blooming scarlet rose. They admired her beauty as they had never seen anything like it before. At that moment, the prince looked at the young people with anger and said that his bride had always been beautiful. He looked at them angrily and said that now they should shout that she had become very beautiful and he had been with her all these years. The young people were taken aback and at the same moment said that they were not simply showing respect for the beauty of the Duchess. Lex was very angry and shouted that he didn't want to hear anything like that at all, because she was always beautiful in his eyes. At that very moment, he looked away and was taken aback as he saw the Duke in front of him. Lex looked at the Duke with bewilderment and asked if he had also decided to take part in the hunt. He understood perfectly well that this was unusual on the Duke's part. Lex mocked the Duke, saying that it seemed to him that he had never been interested in events or hunting. Lex noticed that the Duke's bow had a rather heavy ornamentation. He told the Duke that he, as a swordmaster, needed a different weapon. After some time, the prince rushed into the forest, burning with rage and anger. The prince looked at the Duke with fury and asked if he really meant his fiancée. The Duke asked in bewilderment if the prince really had someone else on the side. The prince was very angry with his words and shouted at the Duke that whoever he gave the rose to was his choice. He always looked at the Duke with a knowing look and asked if there was any other reason why he should get his permission. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he would leave it to his discretion. The prince was very angry with the Duke. He understood that sooner or later he would end up in prison for disrespecting the emperor. A moment later, the prince noticed the lake and decided to cool off a bit. He sighed heavily, but was still absorbed in his thoughts. But a few moments later, he was taken aback as he heard some rustling in the distance. He looked away and froze for a moment as he saw the Duke aiming at someone. He was a little puzzled as the Duke had a very serious and menacing look. A moment later, the prince looked away and saw a white deer. He rose quietly and pulled arrows from his quiver. The prince knew perfectly well that he could not allow the Duke to get his hands on the beautiful white stag. He knew that when it came to hunting, he had no equal. At that very moment, he pulled the arrow and looked into the distance with concentration. But moments later, he turned his arrow away from the beautiful deer and aimed straight at the Duke's horse. He knew perfectly well that it could be written off as a hunting accident, and he knew that the other participants would be easily convinced that it was just a fatal mistake. A moment later, the Duke was taken aback as he felt someone's presence. The prince looked at the Duke with a grin and wondered if he knew what he had felt earlier. But a moment later, the prince was taken aback as he saw that the Duke had changed his trajectory. He was shocked when the Duke released his arrow and it flew towards him. Lex froze in place with fear. He could not move as he saw the Duke's archer approaching him with the speed of lightning. And a moment later, the forest was filled with the prince's eerie scream. Meanwhile, the young ladies sat carefree and chatted with each other. The marquise looked at all the ladies present with a smile and said that her precious fan was made by a Persian master. She said that he should not have given her all the jewelry, but the bracelets, and the fan were given to her by Crown Prince Lex. The lovely ladies looked intently at the marquise and said that these decorations were simply charming, and they were very envious of her. Iveta looked coldly at her friend, but did not answer. At the same moment, the young lady said with a smile that sometimes it was burdensome, and sometimes it seemed to her that he loved her more than his own bride. She looked at her dearly beloved friend with a fake smile and asked with a smirk if she had hurt her with her words. Iveta sighed heavily and said that it was so. The marquise was taken aback, as she expected a completely different answer from her friend. But the young duchess sighed heavily and said that she could not do anything about her feelings, because it was true that the prince cared very much for the marquise. Iveta, holding back tears, told her friend that she was so beautiful and attractive that she could not compare with her all these years, and therefore all this time she sincerely envied the marquise. The marquise was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing. At that very moment, she was caught by the disc and told the marquise that her words had sounded too harsh. The lovely ladies were very angry with the marquise. They said that, even though she had been close to the prince and his bride since childhood, she still needed to watch her words. They said that the duchess had barely gotten back on her feet, and the marquise didn't care about it. The marchioness looked at her friend in bewilderment and asked since when she had called the duchess so familiarly. The lady was taken aback and said that she had communicated with the duchess of the hunting competition itself. Iveta looked at all the ladies present with a smile and said that they should not blame the brand for everything, because they saw that she was her precious friend, and for her she was the most beautiful. The ladies looked at the duchess intently, as they could not understand how she could be so kind-hearted, and they told the marquise that they envied her for having such a friend as the duchess. Iveta looked at the young ladies with a smile and said that they flattered her. She knew very well that all nobles loved scandals, and for them, scandal was like food on the dinner table. The young duchess had a fiancé of noble blood, but she was not so magnanimous as to tolerate adultery under her own nose. But she still knew that the young people simply didn't care about what surrounded them. But the decisive reason was that they so actively demonstrated life and did not hide their relationships at all. Iveta knew that the body's former owner was a very convenient target for the marquise, and the marquise always looked good at the banquet against the backdrop of the shield's bridesmaid, because she was always considered the bridesmaid. And this was a very good screen to cover her own relationship with her fiancé. The marquise was furious and wondered if she had really lost this battle. Iveta mocked the young lady because she knew she had won. At that very moment, their conversation was interrupted as the young man reported that something terrible had happened. He was scared and screamed that the prince was wounded. The young ladies were taken aback, but at that very moment he shouted that the prince was mortally wounded. The prince looked at the doctor with indignation, since he had recently informed him that he simply had a sprain. At that very moment, the Duke looked intently at the prince. The doctor told the prince that if he did not remove the bandage and took the medicine every hour, everything would go smoothly. A moment later, the marquise burst into the prince's tent and called him excitedly. She looked at the prince with tears in her eyes, as she did not understand how something like this could happen. She screamed that her heart was simply breaking into pieces when she saw that the prince was wounded. The prince looked at his beloved with a gentle smile and said that she did not need to worry as the wound was not deep. But the young lady was furious. She did not understand who dared to injure her precious body. She did not understand who dared to allow such a thing to happen to her. She did not understand where his guards were when he was in danger. The prince's assistant was taken aback. He glanced sideways at the duke, but was unable to say anything clearly. At that very moment, the prince told his subordinate to forget about everything that had happened, since he was not obliged to explain anything. Lex looked at the marquise intently and said that he was indeed fine, and that she should calm down already. But the marquise was furious because he had been hurt, and she couldn't just turn a blind eye to it. At that very moment, a young duchess burst into their tent and called the prince. A moment later, she ran up to the prince and asked if he was being treated, and if there would be any complications. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and said that she was very worried. At that moment, the prince became embarrassed, as he did not expect that she would worry about him. A moment later, he broke into a beaming smile and told his bride that he was fine, but now he felt guilty, which was the reason for her tears. After a moment, the marquise looked away from them, as she was disappointed in her. She was furious and told him that everything should have been checked before the event even started, especially if the event included a hunting competition. She spoke furiously about how, due to some negligence, her fiancé, who was part of the imperial family, had suffered. She told the young duchess that even if this was the first time she had organized such an event, this mistake was unforgivable. Ellis mocked her friend, saying that she understood that she was excited about getting all the attention, but she had to be more careful, and in the future, she had to be more careful because she didn't want to see her friends unhappy because of some stupid mistake. In turn, the young lady looked at her dearly beloved friend with her rage, as she was simply talking nonsense, trying to blame her for the fact that the event was disrupted, but the young lady was prepared for this. Evita knew perfectly well that she had to watch her words, since she didn't know how seriously the prince was injured. She understood that even if it was his mistake, he was too stubborn to admit it. The young marquise looked at her friend with a fierce grin as she emerged from this situation as the winner. The duchess would have liked to say at least a word, but at that very moment, the duke looked at the lovely ladies and said that the duchess was not at all to blame for what had happened. He looked at everyone present and said that he was the only one to blame. He sighed heavily and said that it happened because he was unable to kill the deer that attacked the prince. Iveta looked at the young man with bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about and what kind of deer he was talking about. Some time ago, the young duke released his arrow, and it flew at the prince, but he managed to dodge it, and it only grazed him. But when he turned around, he noticed that the duke had shot straight at the deer and hit the target. At that very moment, the deer rebelled and unfortunately hit the prince. The duke looked closely at the young men and said that it was quite unpleasant to get a few bruises and sprains during a hunting competition. But His Highness was frightened when the deer appeared and fell trying to escape from it. Now he felt guilty about all this, because he should have protected him since he was a subject of the emperor. The duke looked at the prince closely and said that he should be more careful in the future. The prince looked away from them, but did not answer. He was annoyed by this. At the same time, the young people looked at the prince with mockery, because he was afraid of the deer, but they understood him because the deer's antlers really could scare anyone. At that very moment, he was filled with shame and looked with anger at everyone present. But the young marquise still shouted to the prince that she was very worried about him. The prince was furious and shouted at her to be quieter. At that moment, he looked angrily at everyone present and asked why they were all crowded into his tent. He shouted that nothing of the sort had happened and that they could continue hunting. A moment later, the young people left the prince's tent and looked at him with grins, since this situation was truly funny, while the duke in turn looked intently at the prince. But a moment later, he quietly passed by the young lady and headed towards the exit. In the end, the duke won the hunting competition. Everyone looked with admiration and surprise at the duke who emerged victorious from this race. After a while, everyone froze in shock and surprise as the duke approached the young duchess, who looked at him with wide eyes. He bowed, and a moment later, he knelt, but in doing so, he presented her with a gift from the winner. She froze for a moment in embarrassment and surprise, as she had not expected such a thing. The Duke handed the beautiful amulet of the victor to the beautiful lady and asked if she would accept such a gift. Iveta froze for a moment, as she had not expected such a thing at all, but after a moment she said with a smile that she would accept this gift with great gratitude. The Duke quickly rose from his knees, and approaching the young lady, he began to place the necklace on her beautiful neck. She looked intently at the Grand Duke, because she could not even imagine what he was thinking. But at the same time, she understood that he was very strange. At the same time, the young ladies looked with joy at the beautiful spectacle, as they were very happy for the Duchess. But not everyone shared such joy. And at the same time, the prince looked at everything that was happening with fury. He was very angry, because he heard all the whispers behind him, because the young people thought that the young lady and the Duke did not look so bad together. After some time, the prince was burning with rage and anger, and he also broke everything that was in his path, but his faithful assistant hastily collected everything that the prince destroyed. But after a few seconds, the prince could not bear it any longer, and angrily stepped on the hand of his assistant, who had previously been collecting the shards of the broken glass. And unfortunately for Roy, the prince caused him unbearable pain. The prince was furious, for he remembered the Duke's mockery, who had asked if he could give the gift to his bride as a token of victory. A moment later, the prince was informed that he had received a message. The prince sighed heavily and told his assistant to get ready, as they still had work to do. Sometime later, the young lady received a message, so she went out at midnight for a secret meeting. She was a little puzzled, as she understood that the young people were simply crazy, as they were arranging secret meetings under cover of night. But she knew that this was a very good opportunity to understand how far they had grown apart. At that very moment, she was taken aback, as she felt that someone had called her. She turned around and froze in place in surprise, as she saw the young Duke in front of her. Rappel looked at the Duchess in bewilderment and asked what she was doing so late at night. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he had forgotten at all, late at night in such a place. At the same moment, she said that she was not going to do anything like that, and also asked what he was doing. He looked at her in bewilderment and said that he had just gone out to get some fresh air, and the young lady turned away from him very quickly and said that in that case he should go on walking. But still, after her words, he stayed near her. A few minutes later, the young lady looked at him sideways and asked if he was really not going to leave. The Duke looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that she looked very funny. She looked at him quietly and told him to be quiet, as she was on a very important mission right now. She asked if he could go for a walk somewhere else. At that very moment, he came close to her and quietly said that if that was the case, then he should accompany her. She was in shock and did not understand why he suddenly made such conclusions. At that very moment, the Duke looked into the distance in bewilderment, since he did not understand why she was sitting in such a place at all. But at that very moment, she covered his mouth with her hand and told him to be quieter. Moments later, they saw the prince in front of them. At that very moment, Lex glanced sideways at the small bushes as he heard some noise. At the same time, the young people sat quietly in the bushes and watched everything that was happening. Iveta sighed heavily and looked closely at the prince, as she assumed that he had already discovered them, but everything worked out. At that very moment, she looked away and realized what was very close to the Duke. For a moment, they froze in place and stared at each other. But a moment later, their romantic atmosphere disappeared into thin air as a young man approached them and called the young Duchess. The prince looked at them in bewilderment and asked his friend who the man was who was next to her. But a moment later, he realized that in front of him was none other than the Duke. Iveta looked at the prince with fury and quietly told him to immediately decide whether to leave or hide. She said that if he understood her, he should simply nod. At that very moment, the young man sat down next to his girlfriend and apologized, as he was very worried about her, while the young lady was puzzled as they had squeezed hers. The prince in turn looked at the Duke with bewilderment and asked what he was doing alone with his girlfriend at such a late hour. The Duke looked at the prince intently and said that apparently he also knew that the lady would be in such a place. The prince was very angry and told the Duke that it was none of his business. He asked the Duke if he could leave them. The young lady noticed that the Marquise was not there yet, but at that moment the Duke said that it was the prince who should go. And in general, the young lady was glad of his presence there, but he could not say that she was glad to see the prince. The Duke said that he simply wanted to report what he had seen himself, but he still asked the prince's forgiveness if his words had offended him. At that very moment, the prince grabbed his friend by the hand and said that she should go with him, and he would accompany her to the room. But a moment later, the Duke seized the young lady by the hand and told the prince that there was no need for that, as he had no intention of retreating, and he intended to escort her to the room. Iveta looked at the young people with suppressed anger, as they were behaving childishly, and this was not at all part of her plans. Hiram looked at the Duke with fury and said that he knew him only a little, but he could not have imagined that he was so biased and persistent. The Duke smiled and told the prince that he was simply flattering him. At that very moment, the young lady pushed the young men aside and said that if they did not help and did not leave, then they should just sit quietly. The young men looked at her in bewilderment, as they did not expect such a thing. She looked at the young people with fury and anger, saying that if they were caught now, she would curse them for eternity. At that very moment, the young lady heard her friend's voice and was taken aback. A moment later, she saw the young marquise, who was running joyfully towards the prince. The Duke looked at the marquise with bewilderment and asked the Duchess if it was her friend who had come running to the prince. Iveta told the Duke to be quieter. Lex looked at the marquise with a smile and called her. The young lady in turn was worried and asked her lover how his wound was. She said with a smile that she was very sorry for what she had done before, but she was very worried. He smiled and said that everything was fine, and it was not so important anymore. But he looked at her with bewilderment and asked why she invited him to meet at such a time. He was worried that someone might see them. But she smiled and told the prince that he did not need to worry, since his bride would never see them. At the same time, she called her friend stupid. The young Duchess looked at her dearly beloved friend with fury, since she still considered her stupid. Iveta was still a little glad about this, since she could catch them off guard. Lex looked at his beloved and said that they had better refrain from such secret dates, because ever since his bride woke up, everything had been going wrong. The Marquise looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he meant. She looked at the prince with tears in her eyes and asked if he really meant to say that they would never be able to see each other again. Lex looked away and said that it wasn't true, and that wasn't what he was talking about at all. He sighed heavily and said that they just needed to be careful. At that moment, he was taken aback as the young lady called him. He was a little puzzled as her tone changed. The young marquise was a little angry. She looked intently at the princesses, said that his attitude towards her had changed since they had attended that reception. He, without looking at his beloved, asked what she meant, because nothing had changed and everything remained the same. The marquise, bursting into tears, asked the prince if he too had fallen victim to the new duchess and her new appearance. The prince was immediately taken aback and asked the young lady how she could say such a thing since she was his only one. She screamed furiously that she had known from the very beginning that his bride had bewitched him and that she had always been only a substitute for him. At that very moment, she was taken aback and froze as he hugged her tightly. A moment later, the prince looked at his beloved and kissed her tenderly. Iveta looked at the young people with fury. The Duke looked closely at his companion and wondered if she already knew everything. He did not at all think that the lady could feel so well if this were not so, for this scene looked shocking even to him, although he was only the third wheel here. Lex looked closely at his beloved and with a tender smile said that his heart belonged only to her, and she should believe him. The young lady, bursting into tears, said that he must do something to prove it to her. She said that if he really loved her, he must win the race tomorrow. She shouted that afterwards he should ask her for a handkerchief in front of everyone. The prince was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing, and at that very moment, he asked if she really wanted to make their relationship public. Lex sighed heavily and said that it was not time to reveal it yet. He said that they had planned everything and would do it as soon as he became the emperor. But the young lady said firmly that this was not so because she was constantly nervous and was not going to endure it any longer. So if he did everything she told him, then she would be able to trust him, and then she would follow him even to the ends of the earth. Iveta looked at the young men with bewilderment. She wondered if her young marquise really thought that it would make her unhappy if a devoted man asked for another woman's handkerchief. She understood perfectly well that this scene could play into her hands in the future. She even assumed that this would be the ideal development of events for her. At that very moment, the prince looked tenderly at his companion and said that he would do it. The young lady blossomed before his eyes at that very moment, and moments later, the young marquise threw herself into the prince's arms. For some time after, the young men sat quietly in ambush without uttering a word. Iveta understood that her dearly beloved friend was too worried, but she knew that the scarf would be an opportunity for Lex to prove his feelings for her. But still, the young lady was not at a loss. She knew that if the prince did this, she would be able to strike the decisive blow. At that very moment, she was taken aback, as the Duke said that he had to apologize to her. He looked closely at his young companion and said that he had poked his nose into my lady's personal affairs, and that this was not an act worthy of respect. She smiled and said that she did not care, but he must keep what he had heard his secret. At that very moment, the Duke cat took his gaze away from her and said that he would certainly help her. Iveta was a little surprised, but in turn also happy. The Duke sighed heavily and said that apparently the purpose of that reception was not to celebrate the miracle, but Sunday. She smiled and said that he quickly figured it out. He looked at her closely and said that she had once told him that she would definitely survive this time. And then the young marquise had said that she had to double the dose of medicine, so he believed that this very medicine must be connected with the fact that my lady had been unconscious 6 months ago. Iveta looked at the Duke in surprise, as he noticed all the facts very quickly. He sighed heavily and said that the aristocracy takes this very seriously, especially when it comes to the fact that the heir to the throne has an affair with a noble lady. The Duke said that, as a loyal servant to His Majesty, he could not allow the situation to take its course, which meant that by intervening in this, he was simply doing his duty. He sighed heavily and asked for permission, as he wanted to help her. She smiled and said that she agreed, and also asked him to wait for her tomorrow in front of the main building of the house. She also said that he should dress accordingly, because they needed to find out how much more useful information. The Duke immediately said that they had agreed, and would see each other tomorrow morning. She understood that no matter how good a plan was, once it was put into action, problems would always arise. At that very moment, she turned around and looked intently at the prince. She asked if they could talk alone. Iveta knew perfectly well that she needed to use all the available variables. The next morning, she was supposed to meet the handsome Duke, but she was preceded by beautiful ladies who looked with admiration at the handsome Duke. After some time, the Duke looked closely at the young lady and greeted her. Iveta looked at the Duke with a smirk and greeted him back officially. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked how she knew he was Duke Winston. She smiled and said she had known it all along, and what he said last night only confirmed it. The Duke looked at his companion with a satisfied smile and said that she had caught him, but he still asked her to keep his little secret a secret because he liked to remain unrecognizable. Iveta smiled and said that she would keep his secret without any problems, but in return, he had to keep their meeting that day a secret. At that very moment, the Duke smiled and agreed with her. A moment later, he looked at her closely and said that she was better than she seemed. Iveta said with a smile that it was very nice, and after half a year of a cruel diet, she was glad to make such a sensation. At the same moment, she asked if he thought the same. He looked at her closely and said that it was really very cool, but all the revenge that he saw in the finale brought people only emptiness and bitterness. Iveta said with a smile that she knows this, but this only happens when revenge becomes the goal of one's whole life. She said that while for her, revenge is an opportunity to achieve a calm and happy life. The Duke looked at her closely and said that he saw that she had already planned her future. Iveta said that she was still thinking about it and that the decision needed to be made in a calm environment, since she just wanted to enjoy her vacation in some resort area, visit the best restaurants, and go beyond her diet. The young lady also really wanted to receive the title of knight because she was quite skilled with a sword. He smiled and said that it would suit her very well. Iveta looked at her companion in surprise and asked if he was really serious about saying such a thing. She asked if he hadn't previously claimed that her skills were insufficient. He sighed heavily and said with a smile that he now saw her, whether his words had hurt her then. The Duke smiled and said that watching her had changed his mind, and he believed that she could somehow achieve anything even if it was an absurd idea. Iveta froze for a moment in embarrassment, But at the same moment, she heard that the Duke valued her very much, and he would be interested to see how far she could go with her persistence. Iveta sighed heavily and looked away from him with embarrassment, but his words were still very pleasant to her. Rappel looked at his companion with a smile and asked what she wanted to do. She sighed heavily and said that she wanted to do only 3 things, and to begin with, he had already heard one of them. He looked at her in surprise because he didn't understand what she was talking about. Iveta looked at the young man with a tender smile and said that they should pretend that they were close. He looked at her in surprise and asked if they really had to pretend that they were close in order to show it to someone. She looked at him with a smile and said that, as expected, he was catching on pretty quickly. The young lady also informed her companion that he had to give up participating in the races. He thought for a moment, as he knew that it was quite difficult. The Duke also asked if he should really be absent from the festive dinner. She smiled and said that this was not so, and that he should come to dinner because she needed a witness. He sighed heavily and said that he understood, but he still wanted to hear her last request. At that very moment, she gave him a signal, and he approached her. The young lady reached out to her ally and quietly began to whisper some information into his ear. A moment later, she looked at him pitifully and asked if what she had told him was possible. Iveta Sir looked at the Duke with a joyful smile as she really appreciated his help. He immediately looked away from her as he was embarrassed by her smile. Finally, the tournament, which was organized by the Duke, was coming to an end, and everyone was going to sum up the results. The young ladies were really looking forward to the beginning, as it was interesting to see who would be the winner. At that very moment, the young lady looked at the Duchess and asked if she by any chance knew what had happened and why the Duke had refused to participate in the tournament. She smiled and said that unfortunately, he had to leave urgently on urgent business. The lovely ladies were very sorry, as they knew that he was one of the main favorites, and they were very sorry that he did not participate in something like this. At that very moment, the Marquise asked casually whether he was afraid of being disgraced. She said that, regardless of whether the Duke participated, the winner would still be the prince. The lovely ladies said that the prince was undoubtedly good, but they did not know whether he could defeat a real swordmaster. The Marquise was furious since the lovely ladies dared to doubt the royal family. The lady looked at the Marquise intently and said that she should not react so harshly, since their friend was simply expressing her opinion. She also said that they all knew perfectly well that she and the prince were in a close relationship, but at the same moment she asked if such a tone was appropriate on the part of the Marquise, and after all, she was not alone here. The Marquise was furious at such words from her friend, and said that the day would come when she would regret her words, and she would have to apologize like that young lady. The young lady was a little puzzled by the Marquise's words, and at the same moment, she said that they would all remember her words. Iveta glanced sideways at her young friend, as she saw that she was no longer even watching her words, and it seemed she trusted the prince very much. She understood that her friend was drowning herself. At that moment, the young crown prince received a lot of applause in his direction as he emerged victorious from the duel. A moment later, all the participants were called to take their places as a new fight was about to begin. It didn't take more than a few minutes for the young man to collide with his opponent from the pedestal. The man looked at the young people with a smile and happily announced that the prince was the winner. Lex looked at everyone present with joy, while the lovely ladies screamed and admired him. But a moment later, he jumped off his horse and went in a hurry to the young ladies. The lovely ladies at the same time were whispering among themselves as they saw that boy was beautiful and suspected that the main heroine of the day and evening would be the Duchess. They looked with joy at the beautiful Duchess as they envied her. But at that very moment, the Marquise looked towards the prince with a fierce grin, as she understood that her dearly beloved friend would not be the heroine of the day. She also did not forget to keep her handkerchief tightly at the ready. The Marquise looked at the young lady with a grin, as she understood that today she would be the only main character, and her friend would only receive the sympathy of everyone else. She looked at the prince with a grin, as she understood that he would not dare look at anyone else but her. The Marquise understood that if her friend had continued to remain fat and ugly, then nothing like this would have happened. But a moment later, everyone froze as they saw that the prince extended his hand to the beautiful bride. Ellis froze in shock when she saw such a sight. Lex looked at his beautiful beloved with a satisfied smile. He immediately asked if she could lend him the knight her beautiful scarf. At that very moment, the young, beautiful lady cried out that she would be happy to give him such a gift, and a moment later, she threw him her precious handkerchief. Everyone present was delighted with this. They shouted and chanted their names. Evita looked at everyone with joy and did not forget to greet them. At the same time, the young marquise, burning with anger and fury, ran wherever her eyes looked. She was very angry and could not believe what had happened. She couldn't understand how he could trade her beautiful lady for someone like a duchess. At that very moment, Evita came closer to her dearly beloved friend, since she had disappeared very suddenly, and therefore she was very worried about her friend. The marquise quickly turned around and looked furiously at her old friend. Evita looked closely at her friend and said that she didn't look well. She asked her friend if anything hurt. Ellis shouted to his friend that it was she who planned everything. She also asked the duchess if she had really cheated on the prince. The young duchess was a little puzzled by her friend's words. She was asking what she meant, since she had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. She looked at the young marquise and said in a calm manner that she was already engaged to the prince, and she had no intention of doing anything like that. But the marquise had no intention of listening to her, and at the same time, she shouted and called her various unflattering names. Evita looked at her young friend with bewilderment and asked for forgiveness, since she still did not understand what was going on and why she was so angry. She said that the people blessed their couple and greeted her. After she gave the prince her handkerchief, she told the marquise that she seemed not to see it, but the prince seemed truly happy. Evita, looking at her friend, said that the prince even called her beloved the marquise, was furious at such words, and at that very moment she shouted at her friend to shut her mouth. But at the same time, she raised her hand and raised it preparing to strike. At that very moment, she directed all her power at her friend, as she wanted to hurt her, but the young duchess intercepted her hand and furiously told her friend that she really did not understand anything, but she also understood that she had already pitied her friend enough. Evita looked at the young lady with a grin and said that she would kindly look at everything from the very beginning. Evita told her friend with pleasure that nothing here was ever hers, while she saw her friend's angry look. The marquise could not bear it, and at that very moment struck her friend with her other hand, which was open. The young duchess was taken aback as she received a very strong blow. At that very moment, she fell to the ground with a crash, but a moment later, the young marquise heard the voice of her lover, who was angry. The prince looked at the young ladies with fury and furiously asked the marquise what she was doing. Some time later, the prince followed his bride in a hurry, but he was puzzled as he could not find her, and asked his subordinate if he was sure that she had gone this way. Roy immediately said that he was sure of it, as the servants had seen her enter. The prince was a little excited as he remembered the previous night. He met with his brother and told him everything. He told his brother that his beloved was jealous and was leaving. He didn't like it all, but as he said, he just couldn't do something like that. Hiram looked at his brother closely and said with a heavy breath that this time everything would not be so simple. Lex looked at his brother in surprise and asked what it was like. Hiram, looking at his brother, said that the duchess herself had organized this reception. He also saw the duke. Did they really think that someone who was smarter and cared so much would abandon his daughter? Lex mentally asked his beloved for forgiveness, since he had to act in this way, because the situation demanded it. He loved the marquise very much, but he could not take his eyes off his bride. After all, every time he looked at his bride, his heart burst, and he wanted very much to take possession of her. Lex was very happy that his bride gave him a wonderful gift in the form of a scarf. Her beautiful smile made all doubts simply disappear, evaporate as if they had never been there. He loved several women and did not want to choose. Lex sighed as he knew he was a sinful man, but he knew there was nothing wrong with that, since he and his fiancée had been engaged from the start. But he was a little worried as he knew he had a few more pesky flies on the horizon. After all, some time ago, his faithful servant told him about the meeting of the Duke and his bride. He said that they looked at each other with loving glances. This news greatly irritated the prince, and he was very angry about it, since he had no intention of sharing his beloved bride with anyone. He was well aware that the young lady belonged only to him, and he did not want anyone else to lay their hands on her. But a moment later, he was taken aback. When he saw a monstrous sight, Lex looked at his beloved in bewilderment and asked what she was doing. He couldn't believe what he had seen a few minutes earlier. A moment later, the young Marquise was taken aback as she clearly heard the voice of her lover. He was furious and didn't understand what had happened, but he wanted to hear her answer to the question he had asked. She was taken aback and said that it wasn't what he thought. At that very moment, he pushed his beloved away and hurried to his bride. She was in shock because now she felt rejected by her lover. She could not believe what had happened, but she saw how he hastily asked his bride in order of lit. Lex looked closely at his bride and asked where it hurt, as he wanted to know such information, but at the same time, he affectionately called her beautiful. She looked at him in surprise, but at the same moment said that she was only slightly injured, but she was fine. Iveta turned her full look of sadness aside and told her dear beloved that she had made him worry again. The prince looked at her intently and said that she should take it for granted because he was her fiancé, and he also asked her not to say such things. She smiled tenderly, but at the same time, her gaze was filled with sadness and sorrow. But still, she said that she was very glad that he was worried about her. At the same time, the Marquise looked at them with anger, since this scene was disgusting. Ellis screamed furiously at the prince that she would not give him to her. But at that very moment, the prince grabbed her hand and looked at her with fury. Ellis angrily asked the prince if he was laughing at her. She shouted that she was not afraid of the Duchess at all, and would fight for him to the end. The young Marquise was furious, and she was also confused because she did not understand what had just happened. But at that very moment, she heard the menacing voice of her lover, who asked her to cool down and leave him alone. Iveta looked at the prince pitifully and said that her young lady had loved him since childhood, and perhaps she was simply jealous of his true bride. She said that she was now feeling a little out of place. Iveta looked away from the prince. Her eyes filled with tears, and sighing heavily, she said that it was entirely her fault. The prince was alarmed. He shouted to the young lady that this was not so, and that he had asked her for a handkerchief. He shouted that he would not allow anyone to blame his beautiful bird. The young Marquise looked at the young men with fury, as she did not expect such a thing. At that very moment, she stood up, and looking at them, superstitiously, said that he could not do it. She was full of anger and fury, and screamed that he could not do this to her, but at that very moment, she could not withstand the pressure, and ran away from them. The prince, in turn, looked after her with contempt, and shouted for her to immediately get out of his sight. He looked after her with fury, but after a moment he looked closely at his bride, and said that he would go and talk to the Marchioness, because whoever she was, she could not behave like this, and she should apologize to the young Duchess. Iveta, looking at the princesses, said that she was already fine, but she still wanted him to be gentler with the young lady. Iveta looked at the young prince with a smile, and said that what the Marquise wanted most of all was for him to console her. Lex looked at his bride with a tender smile, and said that she was just an angel, and he was proud to have such a kind bride. At that very moment, he tenderly kissed her hand, and said that they would see each other in the evening, and he called her his love. She smiled and agreed with him. The prince looked at his subordinate, and told him to escort his bride to her chambers. He agreed with the prince. The young lady stood quietly for a few minutes, and waited patiently for the prince to leave. At that very moment, she looked at the young man and asked if he had a handkerchief. Roy was taken aback, but said that he had everything. A moment later, he gave her a stream, and she began to nervously wipe the dirt from her hand, because she wanted to wipe away the prince's kiss, since she knew that only dirt came out of his mouth. A moment later, she sighed heavily and gave the young man his handkerchief, but said that she had soiled it badly and was afraid that she would have to throw it away. She said that she would certainly buy him a new handkerchief. He agreed with her. The young Duchess sighed heavily and looked at the young man and asked if he was okay, as she had heard earlier that he had been seriously injured. Roy sighed heavily and said that she was okay and that he was coping with his injury, but he also thanked her for her concern. At that very moment, she looked at the young man with a satisfied grin and said that it was very good that he was coping with everything, and also said that there would soon be a brilliant finale. Sherry looked at her mistress with concern and said that she was very upset about the young lady. The young Duchess looked at her entrusted servant and said that there was nothing special in such a sight, and she should calm down because her cheek was only a little swollen. Sherry speeds, since scratches were visible on the snow-white skin of the young mistress, and she was calm. Sherry looked at her mistress and said that no matter how close they were, she slapped her in the face. She didn't understand why her mistress was delayed. She knew that if her lady wasn't so soft, they wouldn't act like this. Sherry was very worried about her mistress. She asked if they should wait or tell the Duke everything. The young lady told her maid that she shouldn't do that because she might get into trouble after she told what happened. The maid looked at her mistress in confusion because she didn't understand what she was talking about. A moment later, the young lady appeared before her maid in all her glory. Iveta knew perfectly well that they had committed murder because of their love. She wondered if their love would be with them at the moment when their revealed sin would be revealed at the heavenly judgment. She looked into the distance and said with a grin about her maid that she was very excited. A moment later, the young lady heard some noise outside the door. At that very moment, she saw her father, who looked at her with joy and said that she was very beautiful. He looked at her intently and asked if she wanted to tell him what was happening. Iveta looked at her father and said that if he found out about everything he might be upset. He sighed heavily and said that she was very stubborn, but still she had already managed to grow up. She smiled and asked her father if he had really only noticed this. After a moment, the Duke stopped and, looking intently at his daughter, said that he believed in her. Iveta looked intently at her father. She was very happy with such words, but at the same time she was embarrassed by such concern. She thanked him with a smile for his warm and affectionate words addressed to her. After some time, the reception began. The young ladies were having a great time and told the Duchess not to forget to invite them next time. Iveta looked at her new acquaintances with a smile and said that they looked great, and she hoped that they would enjoy the evening. A moment later, the prince looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she looked absolutely stunning today. At that very moment, she turned around and greeted the prince with a smile. She ran closer to him and asked what he thought of the outfit, since she had been preparing for several months, so she wanted to hear that the prince liked her exquisite outfit. Lex smiled and asked how he could not like this outfit because she seemed to be dressed in the night sky, which was strewn with stars. At that very moment, the young lady turned her gaze towards her dearly beloved friend, as she was also present at the banquet. Iveta ran to her friend and excitedly said that she couldn't even imagine how she had been going through all this time. The Marchioness looked intently at the young lady and said that it didn't matter, and whatever she thought, it was very strange. She looked furiously at the Duchess and whispered something menacingly. Iveta looked at her friend in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she said. They stared at each other for a moment without saying a word. After some time, a young man approached them and with a smile told the young Duchess that it was very noble of her. He also informed everyone present that the Duchess wanted to give a ceremonial speech. After some time, everyone was watching the young Duchess closely. She looked at everyone present with a smile and thanked them for being able to visit them, as they knew that today she and everyone else were celebrating her day of coming back to life. She smiled and said that she had been unconscious in bed for a long time, but thanks to the care and attention of her family, she was able to stand in front of them today. Iveta S. looked at everyone present and said that she especially wanted to thank some of them, taking advantage of the opportunity. At that very moment, she looked at her old friend, the Marquise, and her fiancé, the Prince. She smiled and asked if they could come closer to her. The young men obeyed her little command, and in doing so, they were the center of everyone's attention. Iveta looked at the young people and said that the time spent in the hospital bed made her look back at her past, and at the same time, she realized that they had begun to play a huge role in her life, and they had become practically family to her. Iveta looked at the young people with a smile and said that she had prepared some champagne that symbolized the two of them. She looked at her family with a smile and asked them to join her and enjoy the wonderful drink. At that very moment, the young people drank the wonderful drink. A moment later, the young man invited everyone to enjoy the number that the Duchess had prepared. The young man invited everyone to enjoy the performance of a real sword dancer. Everyone was waiting for the beautiful artist with admiration and impatience. A moment later, all the guests heard a beautiful dancer approaching them from afar. But a few minutes later, they saw a beautiful young lady with their own eyes. For some time, the young people stared at this performance, not taking their eyes off the beautiful dancer. They were enchanted by her beautiful performance, but at the same time the prince turned away from this performance and looked intently at his friends. Some time ago, the lady was left alone with the prince after the duke left. She looked at the prince intently and said that they could talk in private. He sighed heavily and said that he was very sorry that everything had happened this way. Iveta looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked what he was even talking about. He sighed heavily and told his friend that he would never have thought that they would do something like this. He said that if he had known that she could die at the hands of his brother, he would have acted differently. She looked at him intently and asked if he knew. She knew that nothing would change. Heron sighed heavily and said that his brother was silent about everything and seemed to be just mocking him. He didn't know if it was worth it. He knew that his brother would be the next emperor. After all, he was the heir and older than him. And compared to the other brothers and sisters, he had the best chance to take the throne. Hiron looked closely at his friend and called her. She sighed heavily and said that when she found out the truth, she thought he was an accomplice, but it seems she was wrong. She looked at him with a smile and said that she was very glad that it was not so, and she was still wrong. Heron said in a hurry that it was true that he had acted like a coward, but he had always taken things lightly, so he wanted her to give him a chance to make things right. She said that he shouldn't blame himself, but if that's what he wanted, then she would give him a chance to make things right, because she had one thing for him. Iveta looked closely at the young prince and said that he should advise his brother to ask for her handkerchief as a reward. She said that he would certainly take his own brother's advice and do as he said. She looked at him intently and said that he had to do it, as no one else could complete such a task. The young people looked at each other intently for a while. Iveta looked at her fiancé with a predatory gaze, as she knew that he was constantly torn between her and the marquise. And if it weren't for Heron's help, everything would not be as good as it was now. She sighed heavily, because she knew that she truly couldn't hate him. After a while, the young lady bowed as she finished her speech. The prince looked at the young lady with a joyful and embarrassed smile, and at the same moment, he said that her dance contained unsurpassed beauty and strength, and this simply could not help but delight. The young lady smiled and meekly thanked him for such words, as it was a great honor for her to have the opportunity to entertain the prince despite her modest skills. At that very moment, she said that she had heard that this evening was very important, so she would like to greet the main heroine of the holiday. At that very moment, she approached the marquise alone, and everyone became quiet for a moment. She looked at the marquise with a smile and said that she was very happy to be in such a place. At the same time, the duchess watched everything that was happening closely, as she knew that it was already over. The young lady looked at the marquise intently and thanked her for allowing her to demonstrate her talent. She bowed low and thus expressed her gratitude, but at the same time, she called her young marquise a precious duchess. At that moment, the young girl was taken aback. Iveta looked at them intently, as she expected that the bomb she had prepared with such difficulty would soon explode. After the young girl's words, the prince jumped up and looked at her in bewilderment. Everyone was a little puzzled, as they could not understand why the dancer had confused the marquise with the duchess, since everyone understood perfectly well that the girls were not at all similar, and understood that this was very strange. But at the same time, the marquise and the prince exchanged glances with horror in their eyes. Ellis looked at the girl with bewilderment and asked what was wrong with her. Ellis, puzzled, said that she was of course flattered that she had mistaken her for a duchess. But everything was wrong with the new one, and this joke was just some kind of farce, and she had to stop it immediately. The girl looked at the marquise in bewilderment and asked if she had really mixed up the names since she was the prince's bride. The prince looked at the girl with rage and shouted that she was not even able to recognize the man she called precious. He shouted that this was simply outrageous, and she should be ashamed of such words. At that very moment, the girl screamed and asked if she had really drawn the wrong conclusions. She was taken aback and quickly fell to her knees and began to ask the prince for forgiveness, and also begged him for mercy. He looked at her with a gray expression and shouted for her to immediately get out of his sight. But the duchess intervened in their argument and said that she would like to ask the dancer something. The young people were taken aback and froze for a moment in shock. The duchess looked at the girl closely and said that she could not see her face as she had not attended banquets for a long time, so this was the only time they could see each other. Therefore, she had some doubts, and she wanted to know why the young girl greeted the marquise, and not her, the dancer, hesitated not knowing how to answer the question. At that very moment, the prince shouted angrily at his bride and said that she should not listen to the nonsense of some dancer. But at that very moment, Iveta looked at her groom and said that she would like to sort this matter out. She said that she was really interested because the young girl had never seen her before and greeted the young marquise without hesitation. She said that if it was a simple misunderstanding, then they could settle everything on the spot. Iveta looked at the girl intently and said that she would not hold her accountable, and she should not be afraid, and she could swear by the Duke's name. At that very moment, the girl begging for mercy said that in fact, several months ago, the prince had invited her to perform at his personal villa. She said that there was a beautiful young lady with black hair next to him. They then expressed love and affection for each other throughout her performance. She said she was very surprised because they were focused on each other, and they did not take their gaze off each other. At that very moment, the young marquise threw a glass of wine at the girl. She was furious and could not believe how she dared to speak such nonsense. Ellis angrily asked the girl how a simple dancer could defame the honor of the imperial family and the nobility. The duchess looked closely at the young men as she saw that she had exposed them, and very beautifully. At that very moment, the young marquise fell to the ground. She knew that they were very heartless, and she simply could not bear such a disgrace. She screamed that she was the only daughter of the house, but now some clown dared to insult her. She asked the prince with tears in her eyes to clear her name and punish the girl. At that very moment, the duchess sighed heavily and asked her friend to calm down a little and stop this. She couldn't bear it and burst into tears, but at that very moment, she said that she already knew everything. So she asked her dearly beloved friend not to disfigure herself even more. The marquise looked at the young lady in bewilderment, as she did not understand what she was talking about. All the guests present were surprised and puzzled by this information. They did not know how to react to something like this. At that moment, the young lady sighed heavily and said that she had tried to leave everything as it was, since she had found out about it herself, but she understood that it would no longer be possible to hide something like this. She looked intently at the young men and said that she had to reveal to them the truth that was tearing her soul apart. She burst into tears and said that her fiancé and her best friend had been cheating on her for a long time and had been dating in secret. Everyone present was shocked. They could not believe that the young people had not entered into a formal agreement, and they found it even more difficult to believe that the prince was having an affair with the marquise. The young ladies looked closely at everyone present, as they truly felt sorry for the duchess. They knew that it was extremely unpleasant to learn such a thing about their relatives. The Duke looked at everyone present with fury, as he now understood what truth his daughter had been hiding all this time. Iveta sighed heavily and said that sometimes she felt out of place around them. She knew that they had been close since childhood, and they were dear people to her, and she had never even thought about it. At that very moment, the marquise burst into tears and asked her friend for forgiveness. Ellis asked her friend if she didn't like having her around. The duchess, in turn, looked at the young lady with a gray expression and asked if she would really continue her performance. But the marquise did not give up and continued to cry as she wanted to emerge victorious. The prince looked closely at his bride, and embracing the marquise, said that his concern for the young lady as a younger sister made her feel like a stranger. But still, he noticed that her jealousy was going beyond all bounds. He said that if they had talked about this earlier, this would not have happened. Iveta, in turn, could not stand it, and shouted that she knew what they had done yesterday. Under cover of night, Princip was taken aback, as he had not expected anything like this. At that very moment, she began to cry again. Looking at the young people, they were taken aback in a way they had not expected. Iveta screamed furiously that she had seen everything with her own eyes, had seen how the prince kissed the angry marquise, and at the same time, he whispered that she was his only one. At that moment, the marquise was taken aback and wondered how much the young lady had seen. The prince was shocked by the statement of his bride, but at the same moment, he said that it was true that he met with the young lady yesterday, but they met under the cover of night completely by chance. Lex sighed heavily and told the young lady that there was no need to put on such a show because of a misunderstanding. At that very moment, The Duke came up to them and said that the Duchess was telling the truth, since he also witnessed this meeting. The Duke said that he was returning to the estate late in the evening, having finished all his business, and came across the young lady. But then he froze in shock as he saw her standing there crying because she was confused. Following her gaze, he saw a man and a woman enjoying each other's intimacy. Then, having taken a closer look, he realized who was really at the secret meeting. He looked at the young men closely and said, "Don't believe it, but there is something obvious about it, and he could swear on his family's name and honor that he was telling the truth." Lex could not stand it, and angrily shouted at the Duke that he had tried to get close to his bride, and that he should be ashamed. The Duke glanced sideways at the prince and said that he had already sworn an oath on his family and honor, and he would not have intervened so presumptuously if he had not learned of such personal details of the young lady. Lex was furious because he couldn't object and defend himself. At that moment, the Duke looked intently at everyone present and said with a smile that he simply could not leave the young lady in such a difficult situation. Lex looked at the young people with a fierce grin and asked if his very appearance wasn't suspicious. Lex turned to his bride and said that her brave heart had suffered enough, but there were so many misconceptions around that needed to be dispelled here and now. Lex said that it was imprudent to reveal their relationship in public, so she shouldn't do it anymore. At that very moment, she came closer to the prince and said menacingly that it seemed he had completely lost. She turned around and shouted to everyone present that she had one more terrible fact to reveal. Everyone present was taken aback, as they did not understand how something like this could happen. They did not know who had actually poisoned the young lady. She sighed heavily and said that it was impossible to say for sure, since there was not a single clue, and if it had not been for the confession of one good man, she would never have known the truth. At that very moment, a young man approached her. The young people were shocked because they did not understand why Roy came out to testify against them. At that very moment, the young Duchess looked at the young man and asked him to tell everyone present what had really happened. The young man bowed and greeted everyone and said that he was the prince's personal servant, and seeing the full picture of what had happened to the young lady, he would like to tell everything he knew. A moment later, he showed everyone a very rare poison that was produced only in the principality. He said that if you drink this poison, then within an hour a person will fall asleep, after which the person will be paralyzed and die. And it is very easy to mix it with any drink. He sighed heavily and said that several months ago, the prince had asked for this poison to be secretly provided to him. He was puzzled and said that he was very tired. Everyone present was shocked by what they heard. At that very moment, Lex rushed towards the young man and began shouting that he was ungrateful. He did not understand how the young man dared to slander a member of the royal family. Lex shouted angrily at the young man as he intended to make things right. He swung his arm to hit his servant, but the Duke stopped him. The Duke looked at the prince with anger and told him not to test his patience. At that very moment, Lex turned around and was taken aback as he realized who had actually stopped him. Iveta immediately looked intently at everyone present and said that she had previously written in her invitation that there would be a reception in honor of her resurrection. She said that she had managed to overcome death and wanted to share her joy with everyone. At that very moment, she looked at the Marquise and said that she would like her to know something about what death is. The Marquise turned pale before her eyes from such words. Iveta slowly approached her friend and said that she was the one who did something like that. She told her friend that even if she didn't understand her, they were still friends as always, but at the same time, she was glad to hear something like that, and therefore trusted her. Iveta looked closely at her friend and asked why she did something like that to her. The Marquise was shocked and did not understand what the young lady was talking about. Iveta sighed heavily and said that she heard everything. At that very moment, she said that she heard her friend say that she should have found a better way or taken a larger dose. Iveta smiled and said that she was trembling all over when she learned of their betrayal, but she learned a lesson from it, and now she will have no regrets towards the young Marquise. Iveta Dikaya burst out laughing and told her friend that she was grateful to her for such a lesson. The Marquise looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she meant. Iveta said with a smirk that it was in the liqueur she had drunk recently, and that it was in there that the cauliflower was. She looked at the marquise with fury, because she knew that she would immediately admit her sin. At that very moment, the young lady was taken aback and turned pale before her eyes. She simply could not believe such a thing. Ellis shouted at his friend not to lie to her. She could not think that the young duchess had managed to fool her. The duchess looked closely at her friend and asked her what she thought, whether there was poison there or not. The marquise was taken aback and cried out in bewilderment that there was none. She screamed and called for the prince, but it was all in vain. At that very moment, the duke approached the principal, closer. Lex was taken aback. The duke only gave him an angry and ferocious look. At that very moment, the young marquise rushed away. She shouted for everyone to disperse immediately. A moment later, she grabbed the bottle and began greedily devouring its contents. At that very moment, she fell to the ground with a crash and burst into bitter tears. She screamed and coughed, and the prince meanwhile watched his beloved with horror. She screamed and everyone looked at her in horror. Iveta looked closely at her friend and told her that what she drank with the prince today was only a rare flower wine. She sighed heavily and said that no matter how angry she was, she did not intend to kill them. Iveta looked closely at the young lady and said that she was not a monster at all. At that very moment, the young lady called her father and shouted that she wanted to annul her engagement to the prince and also reopen the investigation. She looked at everyone present with fury and said that she would like to find out the whole truth and make the culprit pay for what he did. At that very moment, the duke looked at his daughter and shouted that he gave her his word that he would find the culprit. He shouted that he would certainly punish those who hurt his daughter. Everyone present supported him. Lex, who was standing next to his father, looked away as he understood that this situation was very bad. The emperor, without objection, told the duke that he agreed, and he also asked the duke if he had any other wishes. At that very moment, the duke said that he would like to be allowed to begin an investigation against the marquise. The marquise was shocked and immediately rushed to the duke. He shouted at the duke not to rush to conclusions, as he was sure that his daughter had been set up, and he did not want the duke to accuse his house based on unverified rumors. The duke looked closely at the marquise and said that all the nobles present at the reception had witnessed the young lady's misdeed. So he thought that he had been generous enough without Togo to cancel only the pension payments to them before the trial. The marquis screamed in rage that the young lady could simply have deliberately set up his daughter in order to take revenge on her. He asked the duke in fear whether he really wanted to say that he would make him his enemy for the sake of his own daughter. The duke looked at the marquise with anger and said that his daughter almost died. He did not understand how he dared to say such a thing. He shouted at the marquise that if he wanted war, then he would get it. He asked if he was ready to draw his sword. But at that very moment, the emperor looked intently at the men and creaked for them to stop immediately. He told the duke that, as his old friend, he deeply regretted this unseemly act. The emperor looked sideways at his son and told the duke that he was deeply shocked that his son, the prince, had become involved in such a matter. The emperor sighed heavily and said that regarding this incident, he, the ruler of the empire, would spare no effort to get to the bottom of the matter. At that very moment, he looked at the young duke, and his father asked him for help in the investigation. Lex was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing from his father. The duke bowed and told the emperor that he would follow his order. At that moment, the duke looked at the young prince with fury, and he was stunned. Lex looked at his father and asked him to stop and listen to him. But at that very moment, the emperor turned around and angrily struck his son in the face. The emperor was very angry with his son and did not spare harsh words for him. He shouted to his son that he had placed great hopes on him, but it seemed that he had made the wrong choice. Lex froze in shock, as he didn't expect anything like this from his father. The emperor angrily told his son to stay in the palace until he gave him permission to leave. The emperor was filled with rage and fury and shouted at his son that he was simply a disgrace to the imperial family. Early in the morning, there was a commotion in the duchy as the maids hurried into the room next to their mistress. The young lady also told her mistress that she had many letters with invitations to social receptions and parties. Iveta sighed heavily and said that it was too annoying, and she was not interested in it at all. At that very moment, she beamed when she felt the magnificent taste of a wonderful dessert. But her faithful servant could not bear it, and burst into tears right in front of her, Iveta looked at the girl in bewilderment and asked why she was crying. Iveta looked at her friend with a smile and said that she was not upset at all, but rather she felt relieved because now all her worries were gone. Sherry looked at her mistress with concern and said that she had been very calm and had slept all day without leaving her room to deal with her heartache. Iveta looked at her friend with a smile and said that it was all just a game. She told her maid that she must think for herself, for people would think her very strange if she began to walk happily through the streets immediately after breaking off her engagement. Sherry was taken aback for a moment as she realized what her mistress was talking about. Iveta looked at the girl with a smile and said that everything was exactly like that, and she was just taking advantage of the opportunity to laze around so the young girl should not worry in vain. But still Iveta thanked her friend for worrying about her. As she left, the girl looked intently at her mistress and said with a smile that in that case she would bring her clothes so that she could change. A moment later, the young duchess noticed a letter on her small table. She knew she was relieved she had been trapped by her engagement to the boor. But now she was free. Her precious friend was now under arrest in the mansion, and the prince was on probation under house arrest in the palace. Thanks to the young man's testimony, they were able to find records of the purchase of poison, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. But suddenly, they reached a dead end. She knew that the young marquise was at peace because her accomplice was the prince. Iveta understood that her precious friend was the only one who was completely trapped that day, because when the prince got his hands on the poison, he obviously already knew about the peculiarities of this flower. So that day he tried to stop the young marquise, but then her father stopped the prince. But as their relationship developed, the young duchess thought that the marquise was going to drag the prince into a dirty battle. She was surprised because she could never have thought that the marquise would remain silent in such a situation. She wondered if the girl really loved the prince that much. Iveta wondered if she really loved him so much that she was ready to take all the blame on herself. At that very moment, she burst into wild laughter because she knew that this was simply the love of the century. But she was still interested in how the prince would react to the situation he had learned. At the same time, there was turmoil in the imperial palace, and the prince plucked up his courage and decided to visit his brother, who was in captivity. A moment later, he entered his brother's room and was stunned by the surroundings. Lex sighed heavily and asked his brother what had happened to the marquise. Aaron immediately said that she had not yet told him anything, and it seemed that she would keep the secret until the end. Lex was puzzled. He knew they couldn't be sure of that. At that very moment, looking into the distance, he asked his brother if his bride had answered anything. Aaron sighed heavily and said that she had not said anything, and several days had already passed since she locked herself in her rooms. Hiram looked at his brother and said with alarm that he had tried to talk to the witness, but it was very difficult to get to him since he was under the protection of the Duke. Hiram looked at his brother with a puzzled expression and said that he didn't know if they could persuade him. Lex was beside himself with anger. He was angry because he knew that several days had already passed, and no matter what the Marquis did, he could not oppose several duchies at once. Lex screamed that his father still hadn't abandoned him, and he knew it wasn't too late, and they could see the deed as someone else. At that very moment, Lex pounced on his brother and shouted that he was useless. He grabbed his brother by the clothes and pulled him closer to himself, asking with fury why he hadn't done anything about this situation. Lex shouted furiously at his brother that he had previously told him to look after the young duchess. He simply could not believe that his brother knew nothing about such a situation. Lex casually pushed his brother and told him to shut his mouth immediately, as he did not want to hear any pathetic excuses. He shouted at his brother to get serious and figure out how to get him out of this situation. Hiram looked at his brother closely and asked why he would do such a thing. He said that the Duchess really loved him. He didn't understand why he should see a woman who only looked at him, even knowing that he didn't take her seriously. Lex looked at his brother in bewilderment and shouted that it was obvious he didn't understand how the Emperor could have a fat woman next to him. Hiram froze in shock and looked at his brother in bewilderment, as he knew that this was simply absurd on his part. Lex sighed heavily and told his brother not to anger him with his stupid jokes. He didn't understand why his brother was suddenly asking such questions. Lex glared at his brother and said that they should focus on how to silence the young Marchioness. He sighed heavily and said that there was only one way out. At that very moment, Lex's face changed, and with a grin, he told his brother that he needed his help with at least one thing. Lex looked at his brother intently and told him to buy some calea flowers. The young man was taken aback, as he had not expected anything like this at all. Some time later, the Duke expected an audience with the prince. A moment later, Prince slowly walked into the room. The Duke sighed heavily, for he knew that the other side of the question came first. He looked at the prince and greeted him, as he was glad to meet them. Hiram looked at the Duke and said that he did not think his visit was that important. The Duke smiled and told the prince that he should understand him correctly, as he was wary of anyone who might be involved. At that very moment, the prince said that he had come to this meeting to help his friend. The Duke said with a grin that he understood the prince perfectly well. The prince did not pay attention to his jab at the guest and said that he really would like to help her. Rappel, looking at the prince, said that it even sounded funny because he had been hanging around all this time, deceiving, and then he came out of his hiding place and decided to help the young lady. The Duke angrily asked the prince if it was too late for him to decide to act. At that very moment, the prince looked intently at the young Duke and asked if he really was pursuing the goal of getting the innocent and gentle Duchess for himself. The Duke said with a grin that the young lady herself had turned to him for help, but that did not mean that he was indifferent to her. But a moment later, he said with a grin that if the young Duchess had been innocent and gentle, she would not have interested him. The prince looked intently at the young man but said nothing. A moment later, the young lady happily burst into their room and greeted them, but they did not answer her. She looked at them in bewilderment, as she did not understand what was wrong with the atmosphere, and at the same moment, she asked if they had really had a fight. Evita looked closely at the young people and said that, first of all, they needed to get a grasp of the situation. She asked the Duke if there was any progress. Rappel, looking at his young companion, said that everything was the same as it was in yesterday's letter. He said that he found the merchant who sold the poison to the prince and received the corresponding document, but it was nothing more than a certificate of smuggling. At that very moment, her young lady looked at the prince and asked how his brother was doing. The prince said that his brother hoped that his beloved would take their common sin to the grave. The young people were taken aback, as they did not expect to hear anything like that. Lex looked at his brother closely and said that there was one thing he had to keep. Lex looked at his brother with a smirk and said that it was not so, and he did not intend to kill anyone. He said that the young marquise would admit her guilt and pay for her sins. He shouted that later, the sick crown prince would die, and he would ascend the throne with the support of the Duke. Lex shouted that he had done a lot of things this time, but his bride was stupid and naive by nature, and when the marquise died, he would remain innocent forever, and then his bride would return to him without any regrets. He shouted that the most beautiful woman in the empire and the imperial throne would belong only to him. Lex, with a fierce grin, shouted that he had thought of everything brilliantly. At that very moment, the room was filled with the wild laughter of the young prince. Hiram was taken aback by horror, as he had not expected anything like this at all. He was his brother. After hearing this, the young lady was a little puzzled, but at that very moment, she realized that the bird locked in the cage had simply gone crazy. Hiram sighed heavily and said that, although his brother's actions had not changed, he had convinced himself that it would be good for the court if he remained silent. The Duke looked at the prince in surprise and asked if he had really gone completely mad. The young lady asked the Duke to hold his horses, but the prince said that everything was fine because he understood their reaction. He said that, as a result, he was forced to wander in circles, hoping that the young Duchess would wake up from the poison. He understood that he was simply a coward and did not expect that she would ever forgive him, but he still looked intently at the Duchess because he did not want to lose her again. He shouted that after much deliberation, he had decided everything for himself. At that very moment, the prince shouted that he would appear as a witness at this trial because he wanted his brother to answer for what he had done. Iveta looked at the young man with a smile and thanked him for his words, but she still refused to do something like that, as she did not want his position to be undermined. He wanted to object to her, but she smiled and said that instead she had thought of one good way, and they should listen to her. Iveta looked at the young people with a smile and informed them that this operation was intended to leave the prince no choice but to admit his guilt. Some time later, the young prince was hurrying to see the young duchess off. She saw that he was impressed and depressed, but at the same time he felt sad and guilty for what he had done. The prince sighed heavily and called her young lady. He asked if that was enough, as he wanted to help her in some way or another. Iveta grabbed the young prince by the face and asked if he still blamed himself. She said that he had done nothing wrong, because he didn't even know about the poison. Iveta looked at the prince with a tender smile and said that everything was in the past. Iveta smiled and thanked him for helping her this time, so she asked him to stop blaming himself for what happened. At that very moment, he hugged the young lady tightly. She was taken aback in a way she had not expected. In fact, she could not forgive him, and only the real owner of the body could do this. But she hoped that the current owner of the body wanted something like this. The young lady was loved and praised by everyone around her because she was the only beauty. She had a noble origin and endless love from the people around her. She had everything. She was the most polite and kind child. Many felt that she was blessed by God. That was until her father said with a smile that she should greet her new friend. Then she saw the beautiful young duchess, who was irresistible. At that moment, the young lady was taken aback as she saw that all attention had been taken away from her. She was puzzled because she didn't understand why everyone was looking at her friend and not at her. One day out of nowhere, the Duke's adopted daughter appeared. People have often shown interest in orphans of unknown origin. The young marquise understood that this was very humiliating. She madly hated the young girl who took everything from her. And sometime later, a brilliant, cunning plan came into her head. The marquise was spending time with her friend, and with innocent eyes asked how she was feeling. Iveta smiled and said that it turned out that she had eaten a lot of desserts, but she could not refuse something like this since the desserts were very tasty. At that time, the young marquise seized upon such an opportunity. She smiled and told her friend that she had become even more beautiful than before, and even the adults would love her who had a good appetite. She happily presented her friend with fresh cream buns from the new bakery, and the young duchess in turn accepted her friend's gifts. After some time, the young marquise regained her happiness, and even when the prince proposed to her friend, she did not flinch, because she knew perfectly well that the prince already loved her. After all, she was hundreds of times more beautiful than the young duchess. But now everything was different, and she was sitting in the house and suffering. A moment later, the young lady noticed her father entering her room. At that very moment, she rushed to her father and asked what had happened. She wanted to know where the prince was now. She screamed and asked her father if he was worried about her. She wanted to know if the prince had given her any message. At that moment, the marquis sighed heavily and told his daughter that she was too loud. He lashed out at his daughter in anger and asked if she didn't realize she had been used all this time. He shouted at his daughter that the prince was just trying to shift all the blame onto her. Ellis was taken aback by her father's words and told her friends that this simply couldn't be because they loved each other more than anything in the world. Ellis hurriedly moved away from her father and shouted that this couldn't be happening and that the prince definitely had some kind of plan. She screamed furiously that he should choose her and not his bride. The marquis sighed heavily because he saw that his daughter was stupid because she could not see beyond her nose. The marquis was puzzled as he felt a terrible shame. He did not understand what had gone wrong because his daughter had been raised as the best bride. At that very moment, a maid came in to the young lady without calling her. She looked intently at the young lady and after a moment said that she had received a letter. Ellis quickly collected the letter from the maid. At that very moment, the young lady burst into tears as she saw that the letter was from her precious lover, as he had been waiting for her at night in the palace. She then felt relieved as she knew that he had not abandoned hers. Some time later, the young League of Pop quietly made her way into the palace under cover of night, but she disguised herself so that no one would recognize her. After some time, she quietly went into the prince's room. She sighed heavily as she had been through a lot, but a few minutes later, she saw the prince in front of her, and with tears in her eyes, she threw herself into his arms. She kissed him tenderly as she was glad to see him. Lex looked at the young lady with a smile and asked how she was feeling, and he also apologized for the fact that they met so late, but he hoped that she had a good time without him. She, bursting into tears, smiled and said that she was ready to wait for him as long as it took. But at that very moment, she was taken aback because she saw that his face was blank. She wanted to know if he was really so upset about this situation. He smiled and said that his problems were nothing compared to her problems. At that very moment, Lex approached the table where the drinks were, and with a smile told his beloved that she had run to him and was probably very tired, so he wanted them to have a little drink and talk. But at that very moment, he quietly opened the poison and began pouring the contents into the glass. He looked at the glasses with a fierce grin, but after a moment, he pulled away as the young lady hugged him tightly. She breathed a sigh of relief and said that she was afraid that he had forgotten about her. But she was more afraid that he might fall for his fiancé's trick. At that very moment, he poured the entire contents of the poison into the glass, and with a gentle smile said that this was not so, and she should not be mistaken. He handed her a glass of poisoned wine, and with a gentle smile said that he could not wait to catch a glimpse of his adored and beloved lady. He said that something like this should not have happened. The young lady looked at the prince with tenderness, as she was very glad that they had met and talked. He smiled and said that they should drink to their reunion. The young marquise, unsuspecting, drank a glass of wine. Lex watched his lover closely as she slowly sipped the drink. Some time later, they moved to a spacious sofa. At that very moment, Lex told his beloved that as soon as everything was over, he would make her an official proposal. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this was true. Lex smiled and said that it was true, and he was very sorry for putting her through all that. He wanted her to forget everything that happened because he wanted to start over. He looked at her with a smile and asked if she would accept his love. The young lady was overcome with feelings. She said with tears in her eyes that she accepted his apology and accepted his love. But moments later, the young marquise felt that her body was not listening to her. She slowly fell and her eyelids closed before the prince. Moments later, he burst into wild laughter when he saw that his beloved had left him. He looked at her with a fierce grin because he was right that she was the perfect woman. He said that his heart was burning, but he had to let her go. At that very moment, he put a small note in her hand and a bottle of poison. He was glad that everything had happened this way, and now he left a suicide note and irrefutable evidence that she had committed suicide. But a moment later, he heard a terrible roar and saw that the Duke and Duchess, as well as the knights, had burst in on him. He was very angry because he did not expect to see them at all. But at that very moment, the knights grabbed him. Lex writhed and screamed for them to let him go immediately, but it was all in vain. At that very moment, the Duke looked intently at the young man and said that he was accused of murdering the Marquise and of complicity in the attempt on the life of the young Duchess, and therefore he must be immediately brought to the palace. In turn, the prince was angry and worried, as he did not expect anything like this. At that very moment, the Marquis burst into the room. He was puzzled and did not understand what had happened. He screamed because the situation was so dire. But a moment later, he froze in place when he saw his daughter. The Marquise was shocked as he saw his daughter lying quietly on the sofa, and the prince writhing angrily and trying to get out. He quickly ran to his daughter and shouted for her to wake up, but it was all in vain. The prince was puzzled and did not understand how something like this could happen. The Marquise screamed in rage and called for his daughter. He screamed and asked the prince what had happened. But at that very moment, he was taken aback as he saw his daughter's suicide note. After reading it, he rushed to their daughter because he realized that he had made a mistake because he had left her alone. He screamed and burst into tears because he knew that if she were alive, he would find a way and make her happy. At that very moment, the prince realized that this was a great opportunity for him. Lex shouted and asked the Marquise for forgiveness. As he was worried about his beloved, he avoided, and in doing so, he violated the emperor's order, but he was still late. He shouted that he actually knew that the Marquise had made a big mistake before the party because of her love for him, and he himself wanted to convince his beloved to apologize to his fiancée. He remembered how, at the party, the young duchess had threatened his beloved and wanted to reveal her cruel heart to the people. The prince screamed furiously at the duchess, as if she had not nursed her grievance, this tragedy would not have happened. The Marquise looked at everyone present with fury. He rushed at the young lady and started screaming that it was her fault her pathetic words had taken his daughter's life. He screamed that she was evil and had to give him back his daughter. He was burning with anger and screamed that he would never forgive her for this. At that very moment, the prince, as if nothing had happened, told the guards to let him go, since he had immediately proven his innocence. The prince was pleased with himself, for he knew that the heavens themselves were on his side. He was glad about everything that happened, since he managed to get out of this situation and become a winner. But to his regret, he did not suspect what was waiting for him ahead. Ellis, in turn, opened her eyes and sat up. She looked sadly at the prince and quietly said that she believed him. He was taken aback and turned pale on the spot as he saw that his beloved was alive. At that very moment, unable to bear it, he fell to the ground and screamed. The young lady looked at him with empty eyes. The young marquise could not bear it. She screamed in rage and cursed the prince. Lex was shocked by everything that was happening. He screamed that it was the boys mentally, and that something like this simply couldn't happen, because she should have been dead. At that moment, the prince was taken aback as he realized that his brother had brought the poison. The duchess said that he had simply replaced the poison with water. The marquise was shocked, as it had all been a show from the very beginning. The duchess looked closely at the marquise and said that it was all true, but today his daughter almost died at the hands of the prince. But they managed to avoid something like that thanks to her. Iveta came closer to the prince and said that it was surprising, because he tried to use a similar number several times. She looked at him with disdain and said that it was very difficult to be a stupid person. Iveta was surprised, because he himself thought that he would succeed. She looked at the prince intently and asked if he had been at least a little happy all these years. Lex could not stand it and attacked the duchess with rage. He wanted to harm her and kill her, but the young lady easily dodged and struck him. The prince was taken aback as she knocked out his tooth that very moment. She looked at her in surprise and asked if something had really happened, since he had only collided with their fragile and vulnerable lady. She came closer to him and said that all this time he was trying to escape. Lex was taken aback and pressed him closer to the ground as he saw the approach of the duchess, who raised her sword over him to deal with him. He was in shock, and at the same time, he did not stop screaming as she beat him mercilessly. Everyone present looked at this spectacle in bewilderment, but no one dared to do anything. The duke looked at the young duchess with a grin as he saw that she had honed her skills to perfection. After a short beating, the young lady looked at him with a smirk and said that it was just self-defense on her part. At that very moment, she rushed towards him, and he screamed with rage and, unable to bear the flow of emotions, burst into tears. Some time later, the trial of the young people took place. The emperor looked closely at the sinful marquise and said that he was giving her one last chance to challenge her sentence. Ellis tearfully asked the emperor and everyone present for forgiveness, as she simply believed in love and in her loved ones. So she dedicated her life to the one she truly loved. At that very moment, she looked at the prince with fury and said that in the end, it turned out to be nothing but a lie and betrayal. She could not bear it and shouted to the great emperor that she was just a victim and her only fault was that she loved the prince, but she was simply deceived. Looking at the emperor, she asked him to punish the prince. She wanted him to punish the one who took advantage of her and her love and trust, and then tried to kill her. The prince was furious and started yelling at her. Iveta looked intently at her friend because she knew that love is war. The prince looked at his father because he did not want to be punished. Iveta sighed heavily and said that when she found out that those who tried to convince her were her lovers and best friend, pain and sadness tore her heart apart. Moreover, they had a high position and were responsible to the people of the empire, and by this outrageous crime, they undermined the authority and nobility of their empire. Iveta said with fury that a noble person is not the one who misleads others for his own benefit. She said that their selfishness is simply dirty and disgusting. She wanted such terrible things to no longer disgrace their great empire. The emperor sighed heavily and said that he heard her words. A moment later, he looked at everyone present and said that he was passing the death sentence on them. He looked intently at the marquise and his son and said that for his monstrous crimes and secret conspiracy against the duchess and for attempted murder, and also for the fact that they tried to hide the crimes and thereby undermined the honor and dignity of the imperial family, he would like to pass an honest sentence. He looked at the prince intently and said that he would lose his status as a prince and would be exiled to the northern border, and the sinner marquise will spend her entire life in a monastery. The marquis burst into tears as he knew that he had lost his daughter, But he was glad that she was still alive while the prince rushed off into the distance, as he could not allow his father to pass such a sentence. The emperor sighed heavily and said that the matter was closed, but the prince begged him for mercy. The prince fell at his father's feet and begged him to send him somewhere beyond the border. He looked at his father intently and began to beg him to change his mind. He said that he would never do anything bad again. He did not want to go to that terrible place at all. The emperor listened patiently to his son. But a moment later, he just snorted and walked away from his son. The young man was puzzled. He screamed and begged his father, but all attempts were in vain. After some time, everyone present began to disperse, and at the same time, they were whispering about a similar matter. At the same time, the young lady rejoiced at how easily she emerged victorious and took revenge on her offenders. The duke looked closely at his daughter and said with a smile that since the emperor was intoxicated by such a decision, he would follow it. Although like his father, he did not like this solution to the problem. He said with fury in his voice that it would not be enough for him, even if he was torn apart. Iveta looked at her father with a smile and said that this was not what she dreamed of. She smiled and said that the pain of death was momentary, but now they both had to live their whole lives in pain. The duke smiled and said that there was indeed meaning in her words. The young lady at that very moment said, with her joyful smile, that now all her problems had disappeared along with them. She told her father that they should not dwell on this and should think about what was now waiting for them ahead. He smiled and said that his daughter was the smartest and most beautiful. She was happy with such words from her father. But at that very moment she became sad, because she realized that her friend Heron still had not left the hall. She hoped that everything would be okay with him. Some time later, the prince stood quietly on the street and reflected on everything that had happened. After some time, the young man told the prince that they were already waiting for him. The prince sighed heavily. He hoped that his friend would live happily, and her days would be filled with light. But a moment later, he saw letters on a small table. He looked at his assistant and asked if these were all the letters for today. The young man sighed heavily and asked the duke if he was expecting a letter from someone else. At that very moment, the duke asked if there had been any letters from the Duchy of Rodelin. Dmitri looked at his master in surprise and said that there had been no letters from the duchy. Rappel sighed heavily, as he had not expected this at all. He was immersed in his thoughts, and in his thoughts all this time was the young, beautiful duchess. He remembered how she had said earlier that this matter was very difficult, and if he did not refuse, she would be very grateful to him, and in return, she would help him when he needed her help. At that very moment, he looked into the distance with a grin, because he knew that it was time for her to pay the bills. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly in her estate. She felt lost, but to her surprise, she received letters and invitations to receptions every day. The letters piled up, but she knew it was very pointless. She was a little puzzled because she didn't understand why she was so bored. At that very moment, she looked at the amulet that her old acquaintance had given her earlier. She knew that the green stone had given her the ability to choose any of the talents. She thought for a moment, as there was one thing that interested her. At that very moment, she threw all her thoughts away, because she understood that she had no reason to choose a hard life. A moment later, the maid looked into her mistress's office and announced with a smile that she had a guest. The maid reported that the guest was the Grand Duke. A moment later, the young lady greeted the Duke with a joyful smile, as they had not seen each other for a long time. He smiled and greeted her. At that very moment, he asked if she had forgotten her promise. Iveta smiled and said that, of course, she had not forgotten, since thanks to him, everything had been resolved very well and quickly, so he should just say what he wanted. He looked at her intently and said that they should discuss this over a cup of tea. At that very moment, he took her hand, and tenderly, looking into her eyes, asked if she would spend the day with him. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. Iveta said with a smile that, if that's the case, then that's how it will be. At that very moment, she asked when he wanted to spend this day with her. He held on side and said that he hadn't thought about it yet. He asked her if she had any problems again, because she had a gloomy face. The young lady was taken aback, at the same moment as she had not even noticed that she had become sad. She smiled and said that there was nothing wrong with that. She had simply worked hard to pave her way, and in doing so, she discovered that she had several paths, But unfortunately, she did not know what risks each road carried. So the young lady sighed heavily and said that she was afraid that she might take a wrong turn, so she wondered which path she should take. The Duke looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if riddles were in fashion again in their day. She smiled and apologized, and also asked if he could pretend that he had not heard anything. At that moment, she smiled and said that they could decide now what they would do. The Duke smiled and said that he thought it would be a good idea to do something that could distract her. He thought for a moment, as he knew it was a very strange thing to say. At that very moment, he looked at her and asked what she thought of him. Iveta was taken aback, as she did not expect such a question. But after a few moments, her mood changed, as she had already thought of how she could take advantage of the Duke. Some time later, they met on the training field. The Duke looked at his companion with a smile and said that if she could wound him at least once out of 15, she would win. Iveta looked at her opponent with a satisfied smile and said that she agreed to this bet. At that very moment, the Duke looked at her with a grin, as he was already ready for battle. A few seconds later, the young lady rushed into battle against her opponent. A few seconds later, they clashed in combat, and C crossed their swords. Iveta looked closely at the Duke, as she was surprised by his skills. She noticed that he did not use mana and only used his skill in battle. However, she knew she had an ace up her sleeve. She glared at the Duke, who was easily dodging her blows. At that very moment, the young lady ducked, as she was about to deal a decisive blow to her music. A moment later, she gathered all her strength into her fist and swung her sword, screaming and striking him. But the Duke still managed to parry the blow, and the young lady immediately fell to the ground with a crash and flew away from him. The Duke quickly rushed to his companion. He was worried and wanted to know how she was feeling, but the young lady only looked at her opponent with a satisfied grin and said that it was her victory. He was taken aback and froze in place from shock, as he did not understand what had happened at all. But at that very moment, he smiled because he saw a hole in his clothes. He looked at his companion with a smile and said that she seemed to have a very keen eye. He looked at her intently without looking away because he saw that she was very happy about her victory. Some time later, they slowly strolled through the garden. Iveta said with a smile that after all the swordmaster was simply magnificent in battle. He smiled and said that if anyone present here was magnificent, it was she, because her passion for the sword was incomparable, even with the knights. The young lady was surprised, as she received a compliment from a cool guy, and at the same time, she was very embarrassed. At that moment, the Duke sighed heavily and said that she had previously spoken of several paths. He smiled and asked if she already knew the answer to the question posed. She was taken aback and said that she knew, but was surprised since she did not understand how he knew that she already knew which path she would take. He smiled and said that at least he knew for sure that she wanted to be honest about her feelings every moment and do everything in her power. The Duke said with a smile that when they first met, she was not afraid and challenged the Viscount, and when he accused her of recklessness, she was brave, answered him, and continued to further develop her skills. He smiled and said that this did not mean that he would stay away, but at the same time, he wanted her to follow the path that her heart called her to. The young lady hesitated and froze in place, as she did not expect to hear anything like that from him. She knew that although all her lives were short-lived, she lived her life to the fullest. So she had no remorse and regret. But this time, she also did not want to regret anything and just wanted to enjoy life. But looking at the beautiful green stone, she had already decided everything.